The rain fell cold on the cemetery grass that November morning, the kind of cold that seeps through wool coats and settles deep in aging bones. Ethan Cole stood alone before the fresh grave, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid Denver air. 54 years old, silver threading through his dark hair, shoulders still broad from decades of construction work, but beginning to carry the weight that comes with time. The headstone was simple granite, still bright and unmarked by weather. Dorothy Ann Cole, it read, beloved mother. The dates beneath told a story of 77 years, but they didn't tell the whole story. They never do. Around him, the cemetery was emptying. The handful of mourners who had come, mostly neighbors from his mother's assisted living facility, had already offered their condolences and hurried back to warm cars. Ethan didn't blame them. It was a Wednesday morning, and people had lives to return to. Jobs, families, purpose. He had none of these things waiting for him. His condo in the Highlands sat empty except for blueprints and takeout containers. His firm could run without him for a few days. And his son, well, his son hadn't answered the phone in 3 years. Ethan pulled his phone from his pocket, the screen already showing Michael's contact photo. A picture from 7 years ago, before the silence. Michael at 21, grinning on a hiking trail somewhere in Rocky Mountain National Park. Father and son had taken that trip to celebrate Michael's college graduation. They'd talked the whole drive about plans, about the future, about how Michael might join Ethan's structural engineering firm someday. That future never came. 3 years later, after Ethan missed Michael's graduate school ceremony because of a crisis at a job site in Phoenix, after one too many phone calls that started with apologies and ended with disappointment, Michael had said the words that still echoed in Ethan's mind at night. You were never there, Dad. You built buildings that will stand for 100 years, but you couldn't build 5 minutes for your own son. Ethan pressed the call button now, listening to the ring. 1, 2, 3. Voicemail. Michael's voice, clipped and formal. You've reached Michael Cole. Leave a message. The beep sounded like an accusation. Ethan opened his mouth, then closed it. What could he say that he hadn't already said in dozens of messages over 3 years? He ended the call without speaking and slipped the phone back into his coat. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wet earth and dying leaves. Ethan looked down at the grave one more time. His mother had spent her final 6 months in a memory care unit, dementia eating away the person she'd been until only fragments remained. Near the end, she'd had moments of strange clarity, but they were disconnected from reality. She'd called him Samuel sometimes, a name he'd never heard before. She'd talked about a cabin in the mountains, about coordinates and secrets. The nurses said it was normal, the mind reaching back through decades, mixing memories with dreams. Ethan had nodded and held her hand and told himself she was already gone. But standing here now, with rain soaking through his coat, he wondered if maybe she'd been trying to tell him something she'd kept locked away for 77 years, waiting until the very end to let it slip free. He turned from the grave and walked back to his truck, a Ford F-250 that had carried him to job sites across Colorado for the past decade. The interior smelled like coffee and work gloves. He sat behind the wheel, not starting the engine, just listening to the rain drum on the roof. His phone buzzed, a text from his business partner, checking in. Ethan typed back a quick response. I'm fine. Need a few days. We'll call next week. The lawyer's office was downtown, a sleek glass building that reflected the gray November sky. Ethan met with Jonathan Reeves, the estate attorney, in a conference room with a view of the mountains. Reeves was younger than Ethan, maybe 40, with the kind of precise manner that came from years of dealing with grief and paperwork. Your mother's estate is straightforward, Reeves said, sliding a folder across the polished table. The house in Aurora sold last year when she moved to memory care. The proceeds went to cover her final expenses. There's a small savings account, about $8,000. That will be yours after probate. Ethan nodded. He didn't need the money. His firm did well. But $8,000 seemed like a small sum to represent a whole life. However, Reeves continued, there is one unusual item. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a sealed manila envelope, aged and brittle looking. Your mother left specific instructions about this. She deposited it with my firm in 2019, with orders that it only be given to you after her death, and only when you were alone. Ethan took the envelope. It was heavier than he expected. The paper was thick, expensive, and across the front, in his mother's careful handwriting, were 3 words: for Ethan, private. Reeves stood. "I'll give you some time. There's coffee in the corner. Take as long as you need." The door clicked shut, and Ethan was alone. He turned the envelope over in his hands. The seal was wax, dark red, pressed with his mother's initials. He broke it carefully, the wax crumbling into pieces on the table. Inside was a letter, written on cream-colored stationery in the same meticulous handwriting his mother had used for grocery lists and birthday cards. November 12th, 2019. The date was 5 years ago, when Dorothy had still been living independently, before the dementia had progressed. "Ethan, my son," the letter began, "I have lied to you your entire life. I'm sorry. I told myself it was for your protection, but perhaps it was for mine. Either way, the time has come for you to know the truth about your grandfather." Ethan blinked. His grandfather? His mother had never talked about her father except to say he died before Ethan was born. He'd always assumed it was a painful subject, a loss she didn't want to revisit. "You asked me once, when you were 10 years old, about my father. You'd seen other kids with grandfathers and wanted to know about yours. I told you he had died in an accident when I was very young. That was half true. He disappeared in 1954 when I was 7 years old. Everyone said he died in the mountains, exposure or accident. But he didn't die randomly. He was taken from us, deliberately, by men who wanted him silenced." The letter continued for 3 pages, dense with details Ethan had never known. His grandfather's name was Samuel Thaddeus Hartwell. He'd been a Marine Corps engineer in World War II, fought at Iwo Jima, came home decorated but haunted. He'd worked in mining engineering after the war, settling in Montana with his wife Margaret and their daughter Dorothy. In 1951, he'd bought a small cabin in the Absaroka Range, a place to escape the noise of town and think. He'd planned to write a book about sustainable mining practices. But then he discovered something that powerful people wanted to keep buried. The letter ended with instructions. "In my bedroom closet," Dorothy had written, "there is a loose floorboard beneath the shoe rack. You'll need a flathead screwdriver. Underneath, you'll find what I've kept hidden for 70 years. It's yours now. Do with it what you think is right. But know this, whatever you decide, your grandfather was not a coward. He was the bravest man I ever knew, and he loved me enough to disappear forever." Ethan sat in the conference room for 20 minutes after finishing the letter, staring at the mountains through the window. Finally, he folded the pages carefully and left. The house in Aurora was a small ranch-style home, the kind built in the 1970s when suburbs were spreading across Colorado's eastern plains. Ethan had the keys from the estate settlement. The inside smelled musty, unused. Most of the furniture had already been donated or sold, leaving empty rooms with clean squares on the carpet where couches and tables had sat for decades. His mother's bedroom was at the end of the hall. The closet was a narrow walk-in, and the shoe rack sat against the back wall. Ethan moved it aside. The floorboards looked uniform at first, but when he knelt and pressed on them, one shifted slightly. He retrieved a screwdriver from his truck and pried up the board. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth, was a metal lockbox. Not large, maybe the size of a shoebox, but heavy. The lock was old-fashioned, brass, tarnished with age. Ethan carried it to the empty living room and set it on the floor. There was no key that he could see. He examined the lock closely. It was a simple mechanism, probably from the 1950s. He could break it, but something made him hesitate. This box had been hidden for 70 years. It deserved more respect than a crowbar. He took out his phone and searched locksmiths near me. 20 minutes later, a man in coveralls arrived with a kit of picks and tools. He had the lock open in under 5 minutes, whistling softly as he worked. "That's a nice piece," the locksmith said. "Don't make them like that anymore." After the man left, Ethan opened the box. Inside was a carefully organized collection of items, each wrapped in tissue paper or cloth. Ethan lifted them out one by one. a brass key with a handwritten tag attached by string. Cabin 12, Absaroka Range, Montana. A topographical map folded and refolded so many times the creases were nearly transparent. Red ink marked a location in the mountains. Coordinates written in margin: 45.2891N, 110.5432 W. A black and white photograph, remarkably well preserved. A man in his mid-40s, strong jaw, serious eyes, wearing an old Marine Corps utility uniform. Beside him, sitting on his shoulders with her hands in his hair, was a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. The back of the photo bore careful handwriting. Samuel and Dorothy, October 1953. Last autumn together. Beneath the photo was an object wrapped in soft leather. Ethan unfolded the material and found a brass compass, heavy and solid in his palm. The face was scratched, but the glass unbroken. The needle swung and settled, pointing north. On the back, engraved in military standard lettering, USMC, Samuel T. Hartwell, Iwo Jima, 1945. The compass felt warm in his hand, though that was impossible. It had been in a box in a dark crawl space for 70 years. Yet Ethan could swear he felt heat radiating from the brass, as if it had been waiting, holding on to some essential energy, ready to fulfill its purpose. At the bottom of the lockbox was a bundle of letters, 12 in total, bound together with a leather cord. The paper was thin, the kind used for airmail during wartime, though these letters had never been mailed. Each was addressed in the same handwriting: to Dorothy, to my daughter, to my brave girl. Ethan untied the cord and opened the first letter. It was dated March 15, 1954, 6 weeks after Samuel Hartwell had disappeared. Dorothy, my brave girl, it began. You are 8 years old now. Your birthday was last week, and I was not there. I'm sorry. I hope your mother made it special. I hope she told you I love you, even if she can't tell you where I am. By the time you read this, if you ever do, you'll be old enough to understand choices. Terrible choices that men sometimes must make. I chose you. I will always choose you. Even if that choice means you grow up thinking I abandoned you. A man's measure is not in the buildings he constructs or the money he earns. A man's measure is in what he protects. I could not protect you by staying, so I protect you by vanishing. Tell your son, if you have one, that I'm sorry. Tell him the compass will always point home. Ethan read the phrase again. Tell your son. His mother had been 8 years old when this was written. She wouldn't have a son for another 16 years. How could Samuel have known? He opened the 7th letter. This one had no date. To the grandson I will never meet. Your name is a mystery to me, but your existence is not. I know you will come. Men in our family are seekers. We build things, structures that will outlast us, but we struggle to build the bridges that matter most. Bridges to the people we love. I failed your grandmother in many ways. I was distant, consumed by work, by the war that never left my head. And then, when I finally learned how to be present, how to be a father to Dorothy, I was forced to leave. You will find this letter when you are lost. Not lost in the mountains, though perhaps that too. Lost in yourself, lost in the gap between who you are and who you wish you'd been. The cabin holds more than evidence of crimes. It holds a mirror. When you see your reflection there, in the windows, in the still water of the creek, in the faces of men who came before you, you will understand why I walked into the snow. The compass doesn't point to treasure. It points to who you are. Ethan set the letter down, his hands shaking. He looked at the compass again, its needle steady, unwavering. North. Always north. But north to what? He spread the topographical map on the floor. The Absaroka Range was rugged country, mountains that stretched along the Montana-Wyoming border. The marked coordinates were remote, miles from any town, accessible only by hiking trails that might not even exist anymore. The nearest town appeared to be Ashford Creek, population marked as 340 in a notation from the 1970s. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor of his mother's empty house, surrounded by the pieces of a mystery 70 years old. Logic told him this was a fool's errand. He was 54 years old with a business to run and a life, however hollow, in Denver. These letters were the writings of a desperate man from another era. The cabin, if it even still stood, would be empty. The evidence Samuel mentioned, whatever it was, would be long gone or irrelevant. But logic wasn't what made Ethan fold the map and put the compass in his pocket. Logic wasn't what made him pack a duffel bag with hiking boots and warm clothes. Logic wasn't what made him load his truck in the dark hours before dawn and point it north toward Montana. It was the other thing, the thing his mother had seen in him when she'd hidden this box. The thing Samuel had somehow known about a grandson he'd never meet. The emptiness. The sense that 54 years of building and working and achieving had constructed nothing that mattered. His marriage had ended in divorce 10 years ago. His son wouldn't speak to him. His mother had died with secrets she'd kept for 8 decades. And Ethan had somehow arrived at middle age with a successful firm, a healthy bank account, and absolutely no idea why any of it had been worth doing. The compass in his pocket felt heavy, pulling him north like gravity. He drove through the night, stopping only for gas and coffee. Interstate 25 carried him north through Wyoming, past Cheyenne and Casper, through landscapes that grew more sparse and wild as the hours passed. The radio played old country songs, the kind his father used to listen to before he died of a heart attack when Ethan was 12. He thought about his father sometimes, another man who'd worked himself into an early grave. Robert Cole had been a good man, quiet and steady, but he'd been absent in the way that good providers often were. Always at the office, always solving someone else's problems. Just like Ethan, just like Samuel probably, before whatever happened in 1954 forced him to make a different choice. The sun rose over the Bighorn Mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks gold and pink. Ethan crossed into Montana mid-morning, the landscape opening into high plains that rolled toward distant ranges. He stopped in Billings for a late breakfast at a truck stop, eating eggs and toast while studying the topographical map. From here, it was another 2 hours to the Absaroka Range. Then the real challenge would begin. He reached Ashford Creek just after noon. The town was smaller than he'd imagined, barely more than a crossroads with a gas station, a general store, a diner, and a motel. The buildings were old but maintained, the kind of place where people took pride in what little they had. A hand-painted sign welcomed visitors to Ashford Creek, gateway to the Absarokas, established 1887. Ethan pulled into this gravel lot of the Pines Motel, a single-story structure with green trim and a neon vacancy sign. The office smelled like pine cleaner and old cigarettes. The woman behind the desk was in her 60s, gray hair pulled into a neat bun, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. "How long you staying?" she asked. "I'm not sure," Ethan said. "Maybe a few days, maybe a week." She quoted him a weekly rate, and he paid in cash. The room was clean and spare, wood paneling on the walls, a painting of elk in a meadow above the bed. Ethan dropped his duffel on the floor and lay down, meaning to rest for just a moment. He woke 3 hours later to the sound of rain on the roof. He walked to the diner as evening fell. The prospector was warm and bright, smelling of coffee and frying meat. A dozen people sat scattered among the booths and tables, locals by the look of them, wearing work clothes and speaking in the easy way of people who'd known each other for years. Ethan took a seat at the counter. The waitress, a woman about his age with kind eyes and tired smile, brought him coffee without asking. "What can I get you, honey?" Ethan ordered a burger and fries. Then, as she turned to go, he said, "Can I ask you something? Do you know anything about a place called Cabin 12 up in the mountains?" The waitress paused, then glanced at an older man sitting alone in a corner booth. He was 70-ish, weathered face, flannel shirt, baseball cap with a faded John Deere logo. The waitress nodded toward him. "You'd want to talk to Earl. He's lived here his whole life." Ethan took his coffee and walked to the booth. "Excuse me, sir. The waitress said you might be able to help me." "I'm looking for a cabin up in the Absarokas, Cabin 12. Earl looked up from his plate of meatloaf. His eyes were sharp despite his age, the kind of eyes that had seen a lot and forgotten little. He studied Ethan for a long moment, then gestured to the opposite seat. "Sit down." Ethan sat. "Cabin 12, Earl said slowly. "That's the Hartwell place. Ain't nobody been up there since before I was born." My daddy used to talk about it sometimes. Said a man lived up there back in the 50s. Engineer or something. Disappeared one winter. They found his tracks heading into a blizzard, then nothing. Everyone figured he froze or fell. Search and rescue gave up after 3 days. He was my grandfather, Ethan said. Earl's eyebrows rose. Well, I'll be damned. Thought that whole line had died out. Your grandfather, huh? He leaned back, considering. What brings you up here after all this time? I found some things, Ethan said carefully. Letters, a map. I want to see the cabin. Earl nodded slowly. It's rough country. Trails overgrown, probably. You done much mountain hiking? Some. I'm from Denver. I know the terrain. Well, it ain't the Rockies. The Absarokas don't forgive mistakes. He pulled a napkin from the dispenser and drew a rough map with a pen from his pocket. You'll want to park at the old logging road off Highway 89. From there, it's about 2.5 miles northeast. Follow Copper Creek until it forks, then take the east branch. The cabin's on a rise above the creek. If you hit scree fields, you've gone too far. Ethan studied the napkin map. Thank you. Earl looked at him seriously. You planning to go alone? Yes. Earl shook his head. That's foolish. But I suppose if you're anything like Samuel Hartwell, you're stubborn as they come. He was a tough old bastard, your grandfather. Marine, fought in the Pacific, came back different, like they all did. But he was decent. Kept to himself mostly, but he'd help if you needed it. Pulled my daddy's truck out of a ditch once in a snowstorm, didn't ask for nothing in return. Did you ever hear why he disappeared? Ethan asked. Earl was quiet for a moment. There were rumors, nothing concrete. Some folks said he'd gotten crossways with the mining company, Resolve. They owned a lot of land around here back then. Still do, actually. Though it's mostly just claims now, no active operations. Word was your grandfather found something he wasn't supposed to find. But that's just old stories. Who knows what's true? Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He thanked Earl again and returned to his meal, but the burger tasted like cardboard. His mind was racing. Resolve Mining, the same name from Samuel's letters. That night, in the motel room, Ethan couldn't sleep. He stood by the window, looking out at the dark shapes of the mountains against the starlit sky. The compass sat on the nightstand, its brass surface catching the dim light. He thought about his son, wondered where Michael was right now. Probably in Seattle, where he'd moved for a tech job 3 years ago. Probably living a life that didn't include his father. Ethan picked up his phone, scrolled to Michael's number. His thumb hovered over the call button. What would he even say? Hey, son, I'm in Montana chasing a ghost. Your great-grandfather, who you never knew existed, left me a mystery. I'm following a 70-year-old trail into the wilderness because I don't know what else to do with my life. He put the phone down and picked up the compass instead. The needle pointed north, steady, true, unwavering. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow, I'll go. And maybe up there, in that cabin, I'll find whatever it is I'm supposed to find. Or maybe I'll just find silence and dust and proof that some stories don't have endings. Just empty rooms where people used to be. But he'd come this far. And men like him, men like Samuel, didn't turn back once they'd started walking. The sun rose cold and clear over Ashford Creek. Ethan was awake before dawn, packing his day pack with water, energy bars, a first aid kit, a flashlight, his phone, even though there'd be no signal, and the compass. He wore hiking boots, layered clothing, and a waterproof shell. November in Montana was unpredictable. The weather could turn in minutes. He found the old logging road exactly where Earl had described it. The gate was unlocked, hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Ethan parked his truck off the road and shouldered his pack. The forest was silent except for the whisper of wind through pines and the distant cry of a hawk. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with scrub and fallen branches. But Ethan could make out the path. It followed Copper Creek, which ran swift and clear over rocks, its banks lined with frost. The air smelled of pine and earth and the particular crispness that comes before snow. His knees protested the uphill grade. He wasn't 30 anymore. Hell, he wasn't 40 anymore. But he kept moving, one step at a time, breathing hard, feeling his muscles wake and burn. After 2 hours, he reached the fork in the creek. The east branch was narrower, tumbling down from higher elevations. The terrain grew steeper, rockier. Ethan's breath came in plumes of white. His legs ached, but he could feel something now, a pull, like the compass in his pack was tugging him forward. Then through a gap in the pines, he saw it. The cabin sat on a small rise above the creek, backed by a wall of mountain stone. It was larger than he'd expected, a solid structure of dark logs, chinked with what looked like original mortar. The roof was covered in pine needles and moss, but appeared intact. The windows were shuttered, the porch sagging slightly on one side. But the whole building stood with a kind of defiant permanence, as if it had decided 70 years ago that it would not fall, would not surrender to weather and time. Ethan approached slowly, his heart pounding. The front door was heavy wood, weathered gray. A padlock held it shut, rusted, but still functional. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key. His hand trembled as he fitted the key into the lock. For a moment, he thought it wouldn't turn, that 70 years of corrosion would defeat him. But then, with a grinding protest, the lock gave way. The hasp fell open. Ethan removed it and pushed on the door. It swung inward with a long, mournful creak. The air that rushed out was cold and still, carrying scents of dust and old wood and something else, something Ethan couldn't quite name. Memory, maybe, or time itself, held in suspension. He stepped inside. The interior was dim, light filtering through cracks in the shutters. As Ethan's eyes adjusted, the room revealed itself. A single large space, maybe 20 by 20 feet. A cot along one wall, a wool blanket folded at the foot with military precision. A wood stove in the corner, cold and dark but not rusted. A simple wooden table with 2 chairs. Shelves lined with books, their spines faded but legible. Engineering manuals, Hemingway, Steinbeck, a Bible with a cracked leather cover, a desk beneath the window, an oil lamp sitting beside an open notebook, a fountain pen lying across the page as if Samuel had just set it down to step outside and never returned. Ethan moved to the desk, his footsteps loud on the wooden floor. He picked up the notebook carefully. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to brown, but the words were still readable. Samuel's handwriting, precise and controlled. The last entry was dated January 27th, 1954. Tomorrow I walk. Not because I am weak, but because I must be strong enough to leave. They have given me no choice. Not really. A man can face bullets and bombs and walk away, but a man cannot face the thought of his daughter in danger and do nothing. So I do the only thing I can. I vanish. I lead them away from her. I give them what they want, which is my silence and my absence. The evidence is hidden where only blood will find it. I leave this compass for the grandson I will never meet. He will need it more than I do. It points north, always north, not to treasure or glory, but to home. And home, in the end, is not a place. It is who you are when no one is watching. It is the man you choose to be when the choice costs everything. Ethan set the notebook down, his vision blurring. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. In the corner of the room, exactly where his mother's letter had said it would be, stood a trunk. Wooden, reinforced with iron bands, stenciled in faded white paint. St. Hartwell, USMC. Ethan knelt before it. The trunk had no lock, just 2 leather straps buckled tight. He unbuckled them, the leather stiff and cracked. He lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather satchel. On top of the satchel, protected in a clear plastic sleeve that had somehow survived 7 decades, was a piece of paper. Ethan lifted it out, held it up to the thin light from the shutters. The handwriting was Samuel's, but the ink looked newer, the paper less aged than the notebook. As if this had been written last, placed here as the final act before walking into the snow. To my grandson, when he arrives, I knew you would come. I have been waiting. Ethan's hands shook so badly he had to set the paper down. He sat back on his heels, his breath coming fast. How could Samuel have known? The rational part of Ethan's mind, the engineer who dealt in mathematics and physics and provable facts, rejected it utterly. The man had been guessing. Or the letter was a forgery, placed here later by someone else. Or this was all some elaborate hoax. But another part of him, the part that had driven him through the night to Montana, the part that had felt the compass warm in his hand, The part that knew bone deep that he was meant to be here. That part believed. He opened the satchel. Inside were more documents, more letters, objects he would spend hours examining. But on top, written on a single sheet of heavy paper, was a letter addressed simply, Ethan. His breath stopped. His name. Written in 1954, before his mother had married, before he'd been born, before any of this should have been possible. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the letter and began to read. Ethan, my grandson. Yes, I know your name. I know you are 54 years old. I know you are reading this in November of 2024. I know you have a son named Michael who no longer speaks to you. I know the weight you carry, the regret, the sense that you have built monuments to nothing. How do I know? 3 nights ago, I had a dream. Your grandmother would say it was nonsense, the mind playing tricks. But I am an engineer, Ethan. I do not believe in tricks. I believe in what I saw. I saw Dorothy as an old woman. I saw her marry a good man named Robert. I saw her hold a baby boy and name him Ethan. I saw that boy grow into a man who built buildings and bridges and forgot to build the one thing that mattered, a connection to his son. In my dream, Dorothy whispered to me. She said, "Tell him to fix what you couldn't. Tell him it's not too late." I don't know if this is madness or prophecy or some strange grace that allows a dying man to see beyond his own ending, but I know this. I am writing to you 70 years before you will read these words, because you need to hear them. The evidence you will find in this cabin is real. Resolve Mining Corporation committed crimes that destroyed lives. They murdered good men. They threatened my daughter. They gave me a choice no father should face. I chose Dorothy's life over truth, over justice, over my own existence. I disappeared so she could live. Was it right? I don't know, but it was all I could do. You have a choice now too, Ethan. You can expose what I found. You can bring justice to men who thought they were beyond it. Or you can walk away. Either path is honorable. But the real treasure in this cabin is not evidence of crimes. It is this compass. Take it. It belonged to my father and his father before him. It has crossed oceans and wars. It has always pointed home. But home is not Montana or Colorado or any place on a map. Home is your son. Home is Michael. Don't wait 70 years to tell him you love him. Don't make my mistake. Don't choose duty over presence. Go find your boy, Ethan. Before you chase ghosts and justice, go find your son. The compass will show you the way. It always has. Your grandfather, Samuel. Ethan sat in the dim cabin, the letter in his hands, and wept. Not the silent tears of earlier, but deep, gasping sobs that came from a place he'd kept locked for decades. He cried for Samuel, who'd walked into a blizzard to save his daughter. He cried for Dorothy, who'd lived 77 years carrying a secret. He cried for Michael, who'd needed a father and gotten a workaholic instead. And he cried for himself, for all the years he'd spent building things that didn't matter while the one thing that did crumbled into silence. Outside, the wind picked up, singing through the pines. Inside the cabin, Ethan Cole held his grandfather's compass and felt, for the first time in years, like he knew which direction to walk. North, the compass pointed north. North toward Denver, north toward Seattle, north toward a son who might not answer the phone, but deserved to hear his father's voice trying. But first, Ethan thought, wiping his eyes, first I finish what you started, Grandpa. Because you gave everything for your daughter. The least I can do is make sure it wasn't for nothing. He stood, his knees protesting, and looked around the cabin one more time. This place had held its breath for 70 years, waiting. Now it could exhale. Now its story could be told. Ethan gathered the satchel, the letters, the evidence. He left the compass on the desk for a moment and stepped outside. The sun was past its peak, the shadows growing long. The forest was quiet, reverent, as if the trees themselves knew what had happened here. He pulled out his phone. No signal, as expected. But he opened the camera and took photos of the cabin, the door, the mountains beyond. Evidence that this place existed, that Samuel Hartwell had been real, that some stories, even after 70 years, could still find their endings. Back inside, Ethan packed everything carefully into his backpack. The satchel with its documents, the letters, the photograph of Samuel and Dorothy, and finally the compass. He held it one more time, watching the needle settle north. "Okay, Grandpa," he whispered. "I'm listening. Let's go home." The hike back down the mountain took less time, gravity helping, but Ethan barely noticed. His mind was racing ahead, planning. He needed to find someone who could authenticate the evidence. He needed to understand what crimes Resolve had committed. He needed to decide if exposing 70-year-old corruption was worth the fight. But more than that, he needed to call his son. As he reached his truck and the sun touched the western peaks, Ethan's phone caught a single bar of signal. Before he could talk himself out of it, he pressed Michael's number. The phone rang, and then, impossibly miraculously, a voice answered. "Hello?" It wasn't Michael. It was a woman's voice, young, uncertain. "Oh," Ethan said, caught off guard. "I'm sorry, I was trying to reach Michael Cole." "This is his phone," the woman said. "I'm his fiancée, Sarah." "Who's calling?" Ethan's heart hammered. Fiancé. Michael was engaged, and Ethan hadn't known. "This is Ethan," he managed. "Michael's father." Silence on the line, then softly. "Oh, Michael's told me about you." The word stung, but Ethan pushed through. "Is he there? Can I speak with him?" "He's at work. He'll be home around 6. Can I have him call you?" "Yes," Ethan said, "please. Tell him it's important. Tell him I found something about family, about his great-grandfather. Tell him I'm sorry and I need to talk to him." Another pause. Then, "I'll tell him, Mr. Cole." The call ended. Ethan sat in his truck, hands shaking, the compass on the dashboard. The needle pointed north, always north, toward Denver, where he'd pack more gear, toward Seattle, where his son was living a life Ethan knew nothing about, toward the future, uncertain and terrifying and full of possibility. He started the engine and pulled onto the road. In the rearview mirror, the Absaroka Range receded, dark and ancient against the November sky. Somewhere up there, in a cabin above Copper Creek, a door stood open for the first time in 70 years. The story was just beginning. The motel room in Ashford Creek smelled like pine cleaner and old carpet, but Ethan barely noticed. He'd spread the contents of Samuel's satchel across the faded bedspread, creating a timeline of evidence that stretched from 1943 to 1954. Each document told a piece of the story, and the story was darker than he'd imagined. The first thing he'd pulled from the satchel was Samuel's field notebook, different from the journal he'd found in the cabin. This one was technical, precise, filled with engineers' sketches and calculations. The early entries, dated 1951, were mundane. Surveys of the property around the cabin, notes on water flow from Copper Creek, measurements for a possible addition to the structure. But then, in June of 1952, the tone changed. June 15, 1952, took Dorothy fishing at Copper Creek. She caught 2 rainbow trout, her first fish ever. Margaret would have been proud. On the way back, found an old survey marker near the eastern ridge, Resolve Mining Claim number 447, dated 1946. But according to federal land records I reviewed last month, that claim was abandoned in 1947. Why is the marker still active? More importantly, why does the trail leading to it look recently used? June 18, 1952. Hiked to claim 447 today. Found concealed entrance to mine shaft, partially covered with brush and deadfall. Someone doesn't want this found. Entrance is shored with new timbers no more than 2 or 3 years old. This mine is not abandoned. June 20th, 1952. Went inside. Should have brought better equipment. Descended maybe 200 feet. Found storage area, not mining operations. Canvas bag stacked against the wall. Opened one. Cash money. $20 bills banded by Montana First Bank, stamps from 1946. Counted 3 bundles, 50 bills each. $3,000 in a single bag. There were at least 30 bags. Ethan set the notebook down and picked up a black and white photograph, cracked and faded. It showed the interior of a mine shaft, lit by what must have been Samuel's flashlight. The canvas bags were clearly visible, stacked in neat rows. In the corner of the photo, partially visible, was something else. A wooden crate with stenciled lettering. Property of Resolve Mining Corporation. The next item was a manila folder, brittle with age but carefully preserved. Inside were documents that made Ethan's hands shake as he read them. Assay reports from 1943 through 1947, showing mineral content of ore samples from Resolve's various claims in the Absaroka Range. But each report existed in two versions. One set showed modest yields of silver and copper, the kind of results that would justify continued operations, but not attract major attention. The second set, stamped confidential and marked for internal use only, showed completely different numbers. The actual mineral content was nearly worthless. The mines were playing out by 1945, barely producing enough ore to cover operating costs. Beneath the assay reports were financial ledgers. Someone, probably Samuel, had annotated them with careful notes in the margins. The ledgers showed money flowing into Resolve Mining from investors in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco. Millions of dollars between 1943 and 1948, raised on the promise of rich mineral deposits in Montana. But the money hadn't gone into mining operations. It had been diverted through a series of shell companies, each one leading to another, until the trail ended at a bank in Havana, Cuba. Ethan understood what he was looking at. This was embezzlement on a massive scale. Resolve Mining had been selling stock and taking investments based on fraudulent assay reports. They'd been paying early investors with money from new investors. A classic pyramid scheme dressed up as a legitimate mining operation. And when the scheme had inevitably started to collapse in the late 1940s, someone at Resolve had decided to hide the evidence and eliminate anyone who knew the truth. The next document made the blood drain from Ethan's face. It was a memorandum on Resolve Mining letterhead, dated September 10, 1949. The handwriting was angular and precise, the signature at the bottom belonging to someone named Howard Ashford, listed as Vice President of Operations. James Caldwell situation. Caldwell has been making inquiries regarding discrepancies in the 1947 audit. He has requested access to the original assay reports and has been asking questions about Claim 447. This is unacceptable. Resolve permanently. Stages equipment accident. Approve immediate action. In the margin, in different handwriting, was a single word and a date. Approved. September 11th, 1949. Ethan Googled James Caldwell Mining Engineer Montana 1949 on his phone. The results came up immediately. A brief obituary from the Billings Gazette, dated September 15, 1949. James Robert Caldwell, 31, of Ashford Creek, was killed yesterday in an industrial accident at a mining site near Copper Ridge. Caldwell, an engineer with Resolve Mining Corporation, was crushed when a support beam collapsed. He is survived by his brother Robert Caldwell of Helena and his parents. The obituary was matter-of-fact, almost dismissive. Another workplace accident in an industry full of them. But Samuel had known. He'd written in the margin of the memo, "This is murder, and I have proof." Ethan stood and walked to the window, needing air, needing to process what he was seeing. Outside, Ashford Creek was settling into evening. Lights came on in windows. A few pickup trucks rolled down Main Street. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that 70 years ago, men had been killed in this very town for knowing too much. He returned to the bed and picked up the next item, a smaller leather pouch, soft with age. Inside was a reel-to-reel audio tape in a metal canister, labeled in Samuel's handwriting, January 26, 1954. Evidence, do not destroy. Ethan stared at the tape. He had no way to play it. Reel-to-reel players hadn't been common for decades. But somewhere in this town, someone might have one. He thought about the old-timer at the diner, Earl. A man who'd lived here his whole life might have connections to people who collected old equipment. But first, there was one more document in the satchel, an envelope sealed with wax that had somehow remained intact for 70 years. Across the front, in Samuel's handwriting, "For Dorothy, to be opened only if I do not return." Ethan held the envelope up to the light from the window. He could see the shadow of folded paper inside. This was meant for his mother, a letter Samuel had written knowing he might never come back. Dorothy had never opened it. She'd hidden it away with everything else, keeping her father's secrets buried for 8 decades. Should he open it? It wasn't addressed to him. But Dorothy was gone. And if there was information inside that could help him understand what had happened, what Samuel had faced, then maybe it was meant to be read now. He broke the seal carefully and unfolded 3 pages of thin paper covered in Samuel's precise handwriting. January 26, 1954. My dearest Dorothy, if you are reading this, then I did not come back from the mountains. I want you to know that I did not leave because I stopped loving you. I did not leave because you did anything wrong. I left because I loved you so much that I would rather disappear forever than risk your life. 3 men came to the cabin tonight. I recognized one of them, Howard Ashford, the vice president of Resolve Mining, the same man whose signature appears on documents ordering the death of James Caldwell. He brought photographs of you, pictures of you walking to school, pictures of you playing in the yard, pictures of your bedroom window with the yellow curtains. He knew things only someone watching you would know. He knew your teacher's name. He knew the route you take home on Tuesdays when your mother works late. He told me I had 2 choices. I could disappear completely, leave Montana, never contact you or your mother again. If I did that, Resolve would leave our family alone. Or I could refuse, and you would disappear instead. He said it very calmly, as if he were discussing the weather. He said children go missing all the time. He said I would spend the rest of my short life knowing I could have saved you, but chose not to. I told him I needed time to think. He gave me 24 hours. That time is almost up. Tomorrow morning, I will walk into the mountains. I will head west, away from where I've hidden the evidence. They will follow me. They will watch me disappear into the wilderness. And they will believe that I've given up, that I've chosen exile over fighting them. They will think the threat is neutralized. But I leave behind something they will never find unless someone comes looking with the right questions. I leave behind proof of what they've done. Murder, fraud, theft, everything documented, everything preserved. Someday, when you are old enough to understand, perhaps you will find this. Perhaps you will choose to expose them, or perhaps you will choose to let it stay buried. Either choice is yours to make. I'm sorry I won't be there to see you grow up. I'm sorry I won't walk you down the aisle or meet my grandchildren. I'm sorry for every birthday and Christmas and ordinary Tuesday I will miss. But I am not sorry for this choice. A father's job is to protect his child, whatever the cost. And this is the only way I know to keep you safe. Be brave, my girl. Be kind. Be the person I always knew you would become. And know that every step I take into those mountains, I will be thinking of you. Every breath will be a prayer for your safety. Every moment will be an act of love. Your father always, Samuel. Ethan read the letter 3 times, his vision blurring with tears. He thought about his mother, 7 years old, waiting for a father who never came home. He thought about her growing up believing she'd been abandoned, carrying that wound for 81 years. And he thought about Samuel, walking into a blizzard to draw killers away from his daughter, choosing a lonely death over her endangered life. What kind of strength did that take? What kind of love? Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. His hands were shaking. He looked at the compass sitting on the nightstand, its needle pointing steadily north. Samuel had left it behind because he knew he wouldn't need it where he was going. He'd walked into the wilderness to die, and the compass had stayed in the cabin for 70 years, waiting for someone to come and finish what he'd started. The phone on the nightstand rang, startling him. The motel's landline. Ethan picked it up. Mr. Cole? It was the voice of the woman from the front desk. You have a visitor. Says his name is Frank Cross. Should I send him up? Ethan hesitated. He didn't know anyone in Montana. Cross, he said slowly. Does he say what he wants? Says it's about your grandfather. Says he's been waiting a long time to talk to someone from the Hartwell family. Send him up, Ethan said. 3 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. Ethan opened it to find a man in his late 60s, tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. He wore jeans, work boots, and a canvas jacket. His eyes were sharp and assessing. "Ethan Cole?" the man asked. "Yes." The man extended his hand. "Frank Cross, retired federal marshal. Can we talk?" Ethan shook his hand and stepped aside. Frank entered the room, his gaze immediately going to the documents spread across the bed. He didn't touch anything, just looked, and Ethan saw recognition in his eyes. "You found it," Frank said quietly. "After all this time. You actually found it." "Found what?" Ethan asked. "Geschichte." "The evidence." Frank pulled out one of the chairs from the small table and sat down. "Samuel Hartwell's evidence against Resolve Mining. I've been looking for it since 1987. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed. "Why?" Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted an old photograph, black and white, creased from being carried for decades. It showed two men in their 30s, standing in front of a mine entrance, both smiling. One of them Ethan recognized from the photos in Samuel's satchel. The same serious eyes, the same military bearing. The other man looked like a younger version of Frank Cross. "That's my uncle," Frank said, pointing to the second man, "James Caldwell. He was my mother's brother. He died in September 1949. They said it was an accident. My family never believed it." Ethan felt a chill run through him. He picked up the memo from the bed, the one ordering James Caldwell's death, and handed it to Frank. Frank read it, his jaw tightening. After a long moment, he set the paper down. "I knew it," he said, his voice rough. "I always knew it. But knowing and proving are different things." "How did you know about Samuel?" Ethan asked. Frank took a breath. "My Uncle James talked to Samuel Hartwell in the summer of 1952. James had found discrepancies in Resolve's financial records. He didn't know what to do with the information. He was scared. He'd seen what happened to people who asked too many questions. But he told Samuel because Samuel was an engineer, someone who understood the mining business but wasn't part of it, someone he thought he could trust. Did Samuel help him?" Frank nodded. Samuel told James to keep his head down, to stop asking questions, to stay quiet. Samuel said he would look into it himself. He said if there was evidence, he would find it, and he would make sure it got to the right people. But then James died in September 1952. Ethan frowned. "The memo says September 1949. Frank's expression hardened. "I misspoke. You're right. September 1949. It's been a long time. The dates run together." Ethan studied Frank's face and saw something there. Grief, yes, but also something else. Guilt, maybe. Or regret. "What happened after James died?" Ethan asked. Samuel disappeared in January 1954, Frank said. "By then I was 18 years old. I joined the army. I didn't know anything about what James and Samuel had been working on. I didn't find out until years later when my mother was dying. She told me that James had been murdered. She said Samuel Hartwell had tried to help, but had vanished before he could do anything. She made me promise I'd find the truth." "And did you?" "I tried." Frank stood and walked to the window. "I became a marshal in 1975. I had access to resources, databases, contacts. I spent 30 years looking into Resolve Mining, but they're good at covering tracks. Shell companies, offshore accounts, lawyers who know how to bury things. I could never find hard evidence. I knew it existed. Samuel had told my uncle he was documenting everything, but I never knew where he'd hidden it." "How did you know I was here?" Frank smiled slightly. "Small town. Word travels. Earl at the diner called me this morning. Said a man from Denver was asking about the Hartwell cabin. Said the man claimed to be Samuel's grandson. I've been waiting for someone like you for 40 years. Ethan gestured to the documents on the bed. "Well, here it is. Everything Samuel found. Financial records, falsified reports, evidence of murder, it's all here." Frank moved to the bed and began examining the documents carefully, his hands steady despite his age. He spent 20 minutes reading, occasionally making soft sounds of recognition or anger. Finally, he straightened. "This is incredible," he said. "This is everything. A safe fraud, investor fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and premeditated murder. With this, we can reopen the investigation into my uncle's death. We can expose what Resolve did. Can we? Ethan asked. This is 70 years old. Most of the people involved are probably dead. Resolve Mining might not even exist anymore. Oh, they exist, Frank said grimly. They're not as powerful as they were, but they're still operating. Small scale now, mostly holding existing claims and leasing land. But the company is still active, and it's still controlled by the same family. What family? The Ashfords. Frank picked up the memo ordering James Caldwell's death. Howard Ashford died in 1978. But his grandson, Richard Ashford, runs Resolve now. He's 72 years old, lives in Billings, very wealthy, very connected, and very interested in making sure the family legacy stays clean. Ethan felt a knot forming in his stomach. So if we go public with this, we're going up against a man with money and power. Frank met his eyes. Yes. And a man who has a lot to lose. Resolve's reputation, his grandfather's name, possibly criminal liability if we can prove he knew about any of this. He won't go quietly. There was a long silence. Ethan thought about Samuel walking into the mountains, about his mother living her whole life with a secret, about Michael waiting in Seattle for a father who'd been chasing ghosts instead of rebuilding bridges. What's the audio tape? Frank asked, pointing to the metal canister. Ethan picked it up. Samuel recorded something on January 26, 1954, the day before he disappeared. I don't know what's on it. I don't have a way to play it. I don't have a way to... Frank smiled. I know someone who does. Mrs. Chen at the antique shop. Her late husband collected old audio equipment. She's helped me with research before. He pulled out his phone. I'll call her. If she's willing, we can go there tomorrow morning. Wait, Ethan said. Before we do this, I need to know something. If we expose this, if we go public, what happens? Frank sat down again. Honestly? I don't know. We'll need to bring in the state attorney general's office. The FBI, probably, for the financial crimes. It'll be a media circus. Resolve will fight back with everything they have. Lawyers, private investigators, PR firms. They'll try to discredit the evidence, discredit you, discredit Samuel's memory. It'll be ugly. And at the end of it, maybe justice, Frank said quietly. Maybe vindication for my uncle and your grandfather. Maybe we force Resolve to answer for what they did. Or maybe we lose. Maybe they bury this again, but at least we'll have tried. Ethan looked at the compass on the nightstand. The needle pointed north, toward home, toward Michael, toward the life he'd put on hold to come here. He could walk away right now. He could take the evidence and burn it, just like Samuel had said in his letter. He could go to Seattle and try to rebuild his relationship with his son and forget any of this had happened. But Samuel hadn't been able to walk away. Even knowing it would cost him everything, he'd documented the crimes, hidden the evidence, and made sure that someday someone would find it. Ethan had come to Montana looking for closure, but what he'd found was responsibility. Let's listen to the tape, he said. Tomorrow morning. And then we'll decide what to do. Frank nodded and stood. I'll be here at 8. He moved toward the door, then paused. Mr. Cole, your grandfather was a brave man. What he did, walking away to protect his daughter. That took more courage than fighting. I hope you know that. I'm starting to, Ethan said. After Frank left, Ethan sat in the quiet room and tried to call Michael again. This time, his son answered. Dad? Michael's voice was wary, surprised. Michael, Ethan said, his throat tight. Thank you for answering. Sarah said you called. Said it was important. There was no warmth in Michael's tone, but he hadn't hung up. That was something. I'm in Montana, Ethan said. I found something. About your great-grandfather, about our family. I know this sounds crazy, but I needed to tell you. There was a long pause. Okay, Michael said finally. What did you find? Ethan took a breath and began to talk. He told Michael about Dorothy's letter, about the cabin, about Samuel and the evidence. He spoke for 20 minutes, and Michael didn't interrupt once. When Ethan finally finished, there was silence on the line. That's a hell of a story, Michael said at last. It's true, Ethan said. All of it. And tomorrow I have to decide what to do with it. What do you want to do? Ethan closed his eyes. I want to do the right thing. I want to make sure Samuel didn't sacrifice everything for nothing. But I'm scared. I'm scared of what it might cost. And I'm scared that while I'm chasing this, I'm losing time with you. Michael was quiet. Then, Dad, can I tell you something? Anything. You've spent my whole life building things. Buildings, bridges, your company, and they're all still standing, but you were never around to see them finished. You were always on to the next project, the next crisis. You never stopped to just be there. I know, Ethan whispered. I know, I'm sorry. But this, Michael continued, this thing with your grandfather, this isn't about building something. This is about honoring someone, about finishing what he started. And that matters, Dad. That's worth doing. Ethan's vision blurred. You think I should expose it? I think you should do whatever feels right. But don't do it because you're running away from me. And don't avoid it because you think you need to fix us first. Do it because it's what Samuel would have wanted. Do it because it's the truth. Michael paused. And then, when you're done, come to Seattle. Meet Sarah. We can talk. Really talk. I'd like that, Ethan said, his voice breaking. Me too, Dad. They talked for another 10 minutes, the first real conversation they'd had in 3 years. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. When they finally said goodbye, Ethan sat holding the phone, feeling lighter than he had in months. That night, he barely slept. He kept thinking about the tape, about what Samuel might have recorded in those final hours before walking into the mountains. The evidence on paper was damning enough, but if there was audio, if Samuel had recorded the threats, if there were voices admitting to crimes, then it would be irrefutable. Morning came cold and clear. Ethan showered, dressed, and packed the documents carefully back into the satchel. The compass went into his jacket pocket. At 8 o'clock sharp, there was a knock on the door. Frank Cross stood outside, holding 2 cups of coffee. Figured you could use this, Frank said, handing one to Ethan. They drove to the antique shop in Frank's truck, a dusty Chevy that had seen better days. Mrs. Chen was waiting for them, a small woman with white hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her shop was cluttered with furniture, old signs, vintage clothing, and shelves full of mechanical odds and ends. Frank tells me you have a reel-to-reel tape, Mrs. Chen said. Ethan handed her the canister. She opened it carefully and examined the tape. This is in good condition, she said. Dry storage, I assume? It was in a cabin in the mountains, Ethan said. Sealed away for 70 years. Mrs. Chen led them to the back room, where an old reel-to-reel player sat on a workbench. I keep this maintained, she said. My husband used to record family stories. He died 5 years ago. But I can't bring myself to get rid of his equipment. She threaded the tape carefully, her fingers practiced and steady. The machine clicked and whirred. Then, through speakers that had been silent for years, a voice emerged, crackled with age and static, but unmistakable. This is Samuel Thaddeus Hartwell. The date is January 26th, 1954. If you are listening to this, then I am either dead or disappeared, and someone has found the evidence I left behind. I am recording this as documentation of events that occurred earlier tonight. 3 men came to my cabin at approximately 7 p.m. There was a pause, the sound of Samuel taking a breath. Then the recording continued, and Ethan heard other voices. Muffled at first, then clearer. Mr. Hartwell, a smooth, educated voice said. Let's be reasonable men. I am being reasonable, Samuel replied. I'm telling you to leave my property. We can't do that. Not until we've reached an understanding. What understanding? Samuel's voice was harder now, edged with anger. The understanding that you will stop asking questions about Resolve Mining. The understanding that you will forget what you found at Claim 447. The understanding that you will keep your mouth shut. There was a long silence. Then Samuel spoke again. You killed James Caldwell. James had an accident. The voice was cold, matter-of-fact. A terrible tragedy. You ordered his murder. I have proof. What you have, Mr. Hartwell, is a very dangerous situation. The voice paused. Let me show you something. There was a rustling sound, paper sliding across wood. That's my daughter, Samuel said, his voice changing, fear creeping in. Yes, 7 years old. Very pretty. Goes to Ashford Creek Elementary School. Her teacher is Mrs. Patterson. Dorothy walks home alone on Tuesdays when your wife works late at the general store. She cuts through the park on Elm Street. She likes to stop at the swings. Samuel's breathing grew heavier on the tape. The voice continued, relentless. We know which window is hers. 2nd floor, yellow curtains. We know she's afraid of the dark, so she keeps a nightlight on. "We know everything about her, Mr. Hartwell." "If you touch her," Samuel's voice shook, "I'll kill you myself." The other man laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "No, you won't, because you're a smart man. You're a father, and fathers do whatever it takes to protect their children. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to disappear completely. You'll walk into the mountains. We'll watch you go. And you'll never contact your family again. Not a letter, not a phone call, nothing." As far as the world is concerned, Samuel Hartwell died of exposure in the winter of 1954. "And if I refuse, then Dorothy disappears. And you'll spend what little time you have left knowing you could have saved her." The voice hardened. "You have 24 hours, Mr. Hartwell. Choose wisely." The recording went silent except for the sound of footsteps, a door closing, then Samuel's voice, alone, broken. "God forgive me, I have no choice. Tomorrow I walk. I lead them away from Dorothy. I make them believe I've given up. And I leave everything behind, all the evidence, all the proof, hidden where only someone who knows to look will find it. Whoever you are, listening to this, please, make this mean something. Don't let them win. Don't let my daughter grow up thinking I abandoned her for no reason. The evidence is real. The crimes are real. James Caldwell was murdered. Others were killed. Millions of dollars were stolen. And these men in their expensive suits with their threats and their photographs of children, they need to answer for what they've done." The tape ran out, clicking softly as the reel spun empty. Mrs. Chen turned off the machine. The room was absolutely silent. Frank Cross had tears running down his weathered face. He wiped them away roughly. "That's Howard Ashford's voice," he said. "I'd recognize it anywhere. I heard him testify once, years ago, at a land dispute hearing. That's him. That's the man who ordered my uncle killed." Mrs. Chen looked at Ethan. "What are you going to do with this?" Ethan stood, his legs shaking. He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the state attorney general's office. And then I'm calling the FBI. And then I'm calling every newspaper between here and New York. Because 70 years ago, my grandfather walked into a blizzard to protect his daughter. The least I can do is make sure the world knows why." Frank gripped his shoulder. "I'll help you. Whatever you need." Ethan nodded. "But first, there's one more thing I have to do." He stepped outside into the cold Montana morning and called Michael. His son answered on the second ring. "Dad?" "I listened to the tape," Ethan said. "I heard them threaten a 7-year-old girl. I heard my grandfather choose to die rather than let them hurt her. And I realized something." "What?" "That's what it means to be a father, not building buildings or making money. It means being willing to sacrifice everything to keep your child safe. And I failed at that. I chose work over you. I chose everything else over being there. But I'm going to fix it, Michael. After this is done, I'm coming to Seattle. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be the father you deserved." There was a long pause. Then Michael's voice, thick with emotion. "I'd like that, Dad. I love you, son. I love you too." Ethan ended the call and stood in the street, the compass heavy in his pocket. The weight of 70 years of secrets finally lifted. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting the peaks gold and crimson. Somewhere up there, in a cabin above Copper Creek, Samuel Hartwell's story was finally being told. And Ethan Cole, 54 years old and starting to understand what it meant to be a man, was ready to finish what his grandfather had started. The state attorney general's office in Helena occupied a stone building that had witnessed a century of Montana justice. Ethan Cole sat in a conference room on the 3rd floor, the February sun streaming through tall windows, casting long shadows across a table covered with 70-year-old evidence. Across from him sat Deputy Attorney General Rebecca Morrison, a woman in her early 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that came from decades of prosecuting difficult cases. Beside her was an FBI agent named Marcus Webb, younger, maybe 40, wearing a suit that marked him as federal rather than local. Frank Cross sat next to Ethan, and on the table between them lay Samuel Hartwell's satchel, its contents methodically organized into evidence folders. The audio tape had been digitized by the FBI's technical team in Billings. Now it played through a laptop speaker, Samuel's voice filling the room with testimony from beyond the grave. Morrison listened without interruption, her expression unchanging. When the tape ended with Samuel's broken plea that someone make his sacrifice mean something, she sat back in her chair, and was quiet for a long moment. "This is extraordinary," she said finally. "The documentation alone would be sufficient to reopen multiple investigations. The audio recording is damning, but you need to understand what you're asking us to do." "I'm asking you to bring charges against the people responsible," Ethan said. Morrison exchanged a glance with Agent Webb. "The people directly responsible are dead," she said. "Howard Ashford died in 1978. The other men on that recording, we've identified 2 of them from voice analysis and historical records, both deceased, one in 1965, one in 1982. "What about Richard Ashford?" Frank asked. "Howard's grandson. He runs Resolve Mining now." Webb leaned forward. "We've looked into Richard Ashford. He's 72 years old, no criminal record, respected businessman. Sits on the boards of 3 hospitals and a university. He was 11 years old when Samuel Hartwell disappeared. We have no evidence he was involved in or even aware of his grandfather's crimes. So he gets to walk away?" Ethan's voice rose. "His family built their fortune on fraud and murder, and he gets to keep it all?" Morrison held up a hand. "I didn't say we wouldn't investigate, but you need to understand the distinction. What Howard Ashford and his associates did was monstrous. But proving that Richard Ashford knowingly benefited from criminal proceeds 70 years later is a different matter entirely. We'll audit Resolve's current operations. We'll examine their financial history. But unless we find evidence that Richard personally engaged in illegal activity or deliberately concealed his grandfather's crimes, there's a limit to what we can do." The room fell silent. Ethan felt the weight of disappointment settling over him. He'd come here expecting justice, clear and swift. Instead, he was learning what Frank had probably already known, that the law was complicated, that time eroded accountability, that powerful families knew how to insulate themselves from the sins of previous generations. "However," Morrison continued, "there's another avenue: civil litigation. The families of the victims, James Caldwell for instance, could file wrongful death suits against the Resolve Mining estate. With this evidence, they'd have a strong case. Any assets that can be traced directly to the embezzlement scheme could potentially be seized. My uncle's family gave up decades ago," Frank said quietly. "His brother Robert died in 2003. There are nephews and nieces, but most of them never even knew the full story." "Then perhaps it's time they learned," Webb said. He looked at Ethan. "This case is going to generate significant media attention. Resolve has operated in Montana for 80 years. The Ashford name is prominent. When this breaks, and it will break, every newspaper in the state will cover it. That kind of scrutiny has its own power." Morrison nodded. "We'll hold a press conference in 3 days. We'll announce the reopening of the James Caldwell death investigation. We'll make public the evidence Samuel Hartwell preserved, and we'll let the court of public opinion do what the legal system may not be able to accomplish quickly." "What about Samuel?" Ethan asked. "Can you clear his name officially?" Morrison's expression softened. "Your grandfather was never charged with a crime, Mr. Cole. There's nothing to clear legally. But we can issue a statement acknowledging his role in documenting these crimes. We can recognize his sacrifice. And we can make sure the historical record reflects the truth. He didn't abandon his family. He protected them." It was something, Ethan thought. Not everything he'd hoped for, but something. He looked at Frank, who gave a small nod. "We'll cooperate fully," Ethan said. "Good." Morrison closed the folder in front of her. "In the meantime, I need you to understand something. The Ashford family will fight this. They have resources, lawyers, public relations firms. They will try to discredit this evidence. They'll claim the documents are forgeries. They'll question the audio tape's authenticity. They'll dig into your background, Mr. Cole, looking for anything they can use to undermine your credibility." "Let them try," Ethan said. "I'm telling the truth." "I believe you," Morrison said. "But truth and proof are different things in a courtroom. Be prepared for a long fight." The meeting ended an hour later with handshakes and assurances of continued cooperation. As Ethan and Frank walked to the parking garage, Frank pulled out his phone. "I need to make some calls," he said. "Robert Caldwell's children deserve to know about this before it hits the news. They deserve the chance to be part of it." Ethan nodded. He checked his own phone and found a text from Michael sent 2 hours earlier. "How did it go?" Ethan typed back. "They're reopening the investigation. Press conference in 3 days. It's really happening. The response came immediately. Proud of you, Dad. Those 3 words meant more than any legal victory could. That night, Ethan stayed in a hotel in Helena, unable to face the long drive back to Ashford Creek. He ordered room service and sat by the window, looking out at the lights of the city. The compass rested on the nightstand, its brass surface catching the lamplight. He thought about Samuel, walking into the mountains with this same compass in his pocket, knowing he'd never use it again. The courage that had taken. The absolute conviction that his daughter's life mattered more than his own. Ethan had spent 54 years building things, but he'd never built anything as important as what Samuel had protected. A child's future, a family's safety, the simple, profound act of putting someone else first. His phone rang, unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. Mr. Cole? The voice was male, older, cultured. My name is Richard Ashford. Ethan sat up straight, his heart suddenly pounding. I understand you've been meeting with the Attorney General's office, Ashford continued. I thought it might be useful for us to speak directly before the situation escalates further. I have nothing to say to you, Ethan said. Please, just 5 minutes of your time. I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm calling because I think we have more in common than you realize. Against his better judgment, Ethan stayed on the line. Talk. There was a pause. Then Ashford spoke again, his voice measured and calm. I learned about my grandfather's activities when I was 30 years old. I'd just taken over resolve mining from my father. I was going through old files, preparing to modernize the company's record-keeping, and I found documents, financial irregularities from the 1940s, correspondence that suggested impropriety. I confronted my father about it. What did he say? Ethan asked. He told me to burn the documents and forget I'd ever seen them. He said what was done, and digging into the past would only hurt innocent people. Our employees, our family, the communities that depended on Resolve for jobs and tax revenue. Did you burn them? Ashford was quiet for a moment. No, I kept them. I locked them away in a safe deposit box, and I've carried the knowledge of what my grandfather did for 42 years. I've tried to run Resolve honestly. I've donated millions to charity, trying to balance the scales somehow. But I've never had the courage to do what you're doing. I've never been willing to sacrifice everything to tell the truth. So why are you calling me? Ethan asked. Because I want you to know that I won't fight you. Ashford's voice grew softer, and Ethan detected something beneath the words: weariness, pain. When the Attorney General holds that press conference, when the media descends on my family, when the lawsuits start, I could hire a dozen lawyers to make your life hell. I could tie this up in court for years. I could use every legal maneuver to protect the Ashford name, but I won't. Why not? Because I don't have time left for that kind of battle. Ashford paused, and Ethan heard him take a slow breath. I'm 72 years old, Mr. Cole. 6 months ago, I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, stage 4. My doctors were optimistic at first, thought we could buy some time with treatment. But the cancer is aggressive. 2 weeks ago, they told me I should start getting my affairs in order. I have weeks left, not months. Maybe a month if I'm lucky. Ethan felt the hostility drain from him, replaced by something more complicated. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. So am I. But it's clarified things wonderfully. When you know you're dying, the things that seemed important fall away. Reputation, legacy, protecting the family name. None of it matters when measured against doing one decent thing before the end. So here's what I'm proposing. Let me meet with you, face to face. Let me show you the documents I've kept hidden. And let me add my testimony to yours. Let me tell the world what my grandfather did. Ethan gripped the phone, unsure if this was genuine or some elaborate trap. How do I know you're telling the truth? You don't, Ashford said simply. But I'm willing to meet you anywhere you choose. Bring witnesses, bring the FBI, bring whoever you want. I just want the chance to do the right thing before I run out of time. Ethan thought for a long moment. Where are you now? Billings. I can be in Helena tomorrow morning. 10 a.m., Ethan said. The Attorney General's conference room. I'll have Deputy A.G. Morrison there. And FBI Agent Webb. If this is real, you'll cooperate fully. I will, Ashford said. And Mr. Cole, thank you for finishing what your grandfather started. The line went dead. Ethan immediately called Morrison's cell phone and explained the conversation. She was skeptical, but agreed to the meeting. Then Ethan called Frank, who was even more suspicious. "It could be a trick," Frank said. "The Ashfords have been covering this up for 70 years. Why would Richard suddenly grow a conscience now?" "Maybe because he's dying," Ethan said. "Maybe because he wants to make peace before the end. Or maybe he wants to get ahead of the story," Frank countered. "Control the narrative, play the repentant grandson, and minimize the damage." "Only one way to find out," Ethan said. He barely slept that night. His mind kept turning over possibilities, angles, potential traps. But beneath the suspicion was something else. Hope. The hope that maybe Richard Ashford was sincere, that maybe one member of the family that had caused so much pain was finally willing to help heal it. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the Attorney General's office 30 minutes early. Morrison was already there, along with Agent Webb and 2 other FBI personnel. They'd set up recording equipment, and Morrison had prepared a formal statement for Ashford to sign if he was truly cooperating. At 10 o'clock exactly, Richard Ashford arrived. He looked like a man at the edge of life, tall but stooped, thin in the way that spoke of rapid weight loss and appetite destroyed by illness. His expensive suit hung loose on his frame, tailored for a body he no longer inhabited. His silver hair was neatly combed but sparse. His skin had the yellowish pallor that Ethan recognized from his mother's final weeks. But his eyes were clear and direct, burning with the peculiar intensity of someone racing against time. He moved slowly, leaning on a carved wooden cane, and Ethan noticed the tremor in his free hand. This was not a man with months left. This was a man counting days. Ashford shook hands with everyone in the room, and when he reached Ethan, he held the grip a moment longer. "Your grandfather was a better man than mine," he said quietly. They sat, and Morrison began the meeting with a formal statement for the record. Ashford listened patiently, then reached into the leather briefcase he'd brought and pulled out a thick folder. "These are copies," he said, placing the folder on the table. "The originals are in a safe deposit box at First Montana Bank in Billings. These documents detail my grandfather's activities from 1943 through 1958. Financial records, correspondence, memos discussing the elimination of witnesses. I've known about these for 42 years, and I've done nothing with them." "That was cowardice. I'm trying to correct that now." Webb took the folder and began examining the contents. After several minutes, he looked up, his expression grave. "These corroborate everything in Samuel Hartwell's evidence. Some of these documents we didn't even know existed." "There's more," Ashford said. He pulled out a smaller envelope. "This is a letter my grandfather wrote to my father in 1977, a year before he died. In it, he confesses to ordering the deaths of 3 men: James Caldwell, a federal auditor named Thomas Price in 1946, and Samuel Hartwell." The room went absolutely still. Ethan's blood turned to ice. "Samuel Hartwell?" he repeated. "But Samuel died of exposure in the mountains." Ashford shook his head slowly. "No, he didn't. According to my grandfather's letter, they followed Samuel into the wilderness on January 28, 1954. They tracked him for 2 days, and when he was too exhausted and hypothermic to resist, they killed him. Made it look like he'd frozen to death. My grandfather wrote that Samuel never stopped moving. Even when he must have known he couldn't escape, he kept going deeper into the mountains, leading them away from Ashford Creek, away from his daughter." Morrison reached for the letter, her hands trembling slightly. "May I?" Ashford handed it over. She read in silence, her jaw tightening. When she finished, she looked at Webb. "This is a confession to first-degree murder." Webb nodded. "Even though Howard Ashford is deceased, this changes the investigation significantly. Samuel Hartwell's death was not accidental, it was homicide." Ethan couldn't speak. He'd known Samuel had sacrificed himself, but he'd always imagined his grandfather dying alone in the snow, succumbing to the elements. The idea that he'd been murdered, hunted down and killed even after he'd chosen exile, was almost too much to bear. Frank put a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Ashford's voice was heavy with regret. "I'm sorry too, Mr. Cole. My grandfather was a monster. He destroyed lives to protect his wealth and reputation, and my family has benefited from those crimes for 7 decades. I can't undo that, but I can help bring the truth to light." Morrison had regained her composure. "Mr. Ashford, are you willing to make a formal statement? Are you willing to testify to all of this publicly?" "I am," Ashford said. I'll give you full access to all documents I possess. I'll testify in any proceeding, civil or criminal. I'll cooperate completely. And resolve mining? Webb asked. What happens to the company? Ashford met his gaze. I'm dissolving it. I've already begun the process. All remaining assets will be liquidated. Half will go to a victim compensation fund for the families of those my grandfather harmed. The other half will go to environmental remediation of the mine sites Resolve operated. The Ashford name ends with me, and I want it to end making restitution rather than continuing to profit from blood money. The meeting continued for 3 more hours. Ashford answered every question, provided every document, signed every statement. When it finally ended, Morrison stood and extended her hand. Mr. Ashford, what you're doing takes courage. It won't erase what your grandfather did, but it's the right thing. Ashford shook her hand. I should have done it 42 years ago. He turned to Ethan. May I speak with you privately for a moment? Ethan hesitated, then nodded. They stepped into an empty office down the hall. Ashford closed the door and leaned heavily against the desk, his strength clearly fading. I know this doesn't fix anything, he said. I know your family suffered because of mine. But I wanted to tell you something my grandfather wrote in that letter to my father. Something I think you should know. What is it? Ethan asked. Howard wrote that Samuel Hartwell was the bravest man he'd ever encountered. He said they'd threatened dozens of people over the years, and all of them had folded. But Samuel refused, even when they showed him photographs of his daughter, even when they made it clear they'd kill her. He wouldn't give up the evidence. He'd only agree to disappear. And when they followed him into the mountains, planning to retrieve the location of the evidence before killing him, Samuel never broke. He led them on a 2-day chase through a blizzard, getting weaker with every hour. But he never told them where he'd hidden the documents. He died protecting that secret. Ethan's eyes burned with tears. My grandfather wrote that in all his years in the Marines, in all the war zones he'd seen, he'd never witnessed that kind of courage. He said it haunted him for the rest of his life. Ashford's voice cracked. I thought you should know. Your grandfather didn't just sacrifice himself. He won, because they never found the evidence. And now, 70 years later, it's bringing them down. Thank you, Ethan whispered. Ashford straightened with effort. There's one more thing. When I pass, and it will be soon, there will be others who come forward. My family is larger than you might think. My wife died 5 years ago, and we had no children. But there are cousins, distant relatives. One of them, a woman about my age, was adopted into the Hartwell family in the 1950s. She carries Samuel's name, though she's not blood. I've reached out to her. She may want to be part of the story. I thought you should know. Ethan felt a chill. Samuel's family extended further than he'd known. Thank you for telling me. Ashford extended his hand one last time. I'm going to spend whatever days I have left trying to make this right. It won't be enough, but it's all I can do. They shook hands, and Ashford left, moving slowly, the cane tapping against the marble floor. Ethan stood alone in the empty office, his heart breaking and healing at the same time. Samuel had won. Against impossible odds, facing death itself, he had protected his daughter and preserved the truth. And now that truth was finally being heard. The press conference was scheduled for the following Monday at noon. Morrison's office had alerted major media outlets. The story was already starting to leak. Small pieces appearing in Montana newspapers. Speculation about a major announcement regarding historic mining fraud. Ethan spent the weekend in Ashford Creek, returning to the cabin one last time. The hike up was easier now. The trail was becoming familiar. When he reached the cabin, he found it exactly as he'd left it. Peaceful, silent, waiting. He sat on the porch and called Michael. Hey, Dad, Michael answered. Big day coming up. Yeah, Ethan said. Listen, I wanted to ask you something. The press conference is Monday. After that, I thought I'd drive to Seattle, if the offer's still open. There was a pause, then Michael's voice, warm and genuine. It's absolutely open. Sarah's excited to meet you. We've been talking about it all week. I'm nervous, Ethan admitted. Me too, Michael said. But good nervous, like maybe we can finally get this right. I hope so, Ethan said. I want to. I really want to. Then come, Michael said simply. We'll figure it out together. After the call, Ethan walked down to Copper Creek. The water ran clear and cold, just as it had in 1954, when Samuel had fished here with Dorothy. He pulled the compass from his pocket and held it over the stream, watching the needle point north. "Thank you, Grandpa," he said aloud, "for being strong enough to walk away, for protecting Dorothy, for making sure the truth survived." The wind moved through the pines, and for just a moment, Ethan could have sworn he heard a voice in it. Not words exactly, but a feeling, a sense of completion, of a circle closing, of a burden finally lifted. He spent the night in the cabin, sleeping on the same cot Samuel had used. His dreams were full of mountains and snow, and a man walking alone into the wilderness, getting weaker with every step but refusing to stop, refusing to surrender, carrying his secrets deeper into the frozen peaks, where his enemies could never follow. When Ethan woke at dawn, he found frost on the windows. He made coffee on the wood stove using supplies he'd brought from town. As he drank it, sitting at Samuel's desk, he thought about the men in his family. His father, Robert, who'd worked himself to death. Samuel, who'd walked into the snow. And himself, Ethan Cole, 54 years old, and only now learning what really mattered. Legacy wasn't buildings or money or success. Legacy was what you protected, who you protected, the sacrifices you made so that the people you loved could live without fear. Ethan had been chasing his father's ghost his whole life, trying to prove he was just as capable, just as driven. But he'd been chasing the wrong thing. His father had died young, worn down by work. Samuel had died a hero, protecting his child. The lesson wasn't to work harder or achieve more. The lesson was to know what was worth dying for, and to live for it instead. Monday morning arrived cold and bright. The press conference was held in the rotunda of the state capitol building in Helena, a grand space with marble floors and soaring ceilings. 50 journalists packed the room, cameras rolling, microphones extended. Deputy Attorney General Morrison stood at a podium, flanked by Agent Webb and Frank Cross. Ethan stood to the side, uncomfortable in the suit he'd worn to his mother's funeral. Morrison had offered to let him speak, but he declined. This wasn't about him. This was about Samuel and James Caldwell and all the others who'd been silenced. Morrison's statement was clear and comprehensive. She detailed the evidence. She announced the reopening of multiple death investigations. She acknowledged Samuel Hartwell's sacrifice and Richard Ashford's cooperation. And she made it clear that Resolve Mining's 70-year history of fraud and violence was finally being brought to light. The questions from the press were aggressive, skeptical, demanding. Morrison handled them with professional calm. When one reporter asked why it had taken 70 years to uncover these crimes, she simply said sometimes the truth has to wait for someone brave enough to dig it up. After the press conference, Ethan was swarmed by journalists wanting individual interviews. He gave 3 on-camera statements, keeping them brief, focusing on Samuel's courage rather than his own role. By the time he escaped to Frank's truck, he was exhausted. "You did good," Frank said as they drove away from the Capitol. "Samuel did good," Ethan corrected. "I just opened a box." Frank smiled. "Sometimes that's all it takes. One person willing to open what everyone else wants to keep closed." They stopped for lunch at a diner, and halfway through their meal, Frank's phone rang. He answered, listened for a moment, then his face went pale. "When?" he asked. He listened more. "How long was he there?" Another pause. "I understand. Thank you for telling me." He ended the call and set the phone down carefully. "That was Morrison," he said. "Richard Ashford entered hospice care late last night, about 2 hours after our meeting ended yesterday. He'd refused all further treatment. The hospice staff said he told them he'd finished what he needed to do. He passed away peacefully this morning, just after sunrise." Ethan was quiet, processing. He'd only met Ashford once, but somehow the news hit harder than he'd expected. The man had spent 42 years carrying his grandfather's sins, and in his final days, he'd done the only thing he could to make it right. That took a kind of courage, too. "At least he got to tell the truth before the end," Ethan said. Frank nodded. He got to make his peace. That's more than most people get. They finished their meal in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Afterward, Frank drove Ethan back to his truck, still parked at the motel in Ashford Creek. "What are you going to do now?" Frank asked. "I'm going to Seattle," Ethan said. "I'm going to see my son. And then I'm going to figure out how to be present instead of busy. How to build relationships instead of buildings." Frank extended his hand. "Your grandfather would be proud." "I hope so," Ethan said, shaking it. "And Frank, thank you for carrying this all these years, for not giving up on your uncle." "Family's worth fighting for," Frank said. "Even when the fight takes half a century." Ethan climbed into his truck and pointed it north. The compass sat on the dashboard, its needle steady and true. North to Denver to pack up his condo, north to Seattle to meet his son's fiancée and start rebuilding what he'd let crumble, north to whatever came next. As he drove through the Montana landscape, mountains giving way to plains, he thought about everything that had happened in the past 2 weeks. He'd come to Montana looking for closure about a grandfather he'd never known. Instead, he'd found a mirror, a reflection of his own failures, and a roadmap for how to fix them. Samuel hadn't been perfect. He'd been distant and consumed by work, just like Ethan. But when the moment came, when the choice was between career and family, between pride and sacrifice, Samuel had chosen right. He'd walked into the mountains knowing he'd never return, but also knowing his daughter would be safe. Ethan couldn't change the past. He couldn't give Michael back the father he'd needed when he was young, but he could be the father Michael needed now. The grandfather he might someday be. He could break the pattern that had haunted 3 generations of men in his family. He could choose presence over productivity, connection over achievement. His phone buzzed with the text from Michael. "Safe travels, Dad. We'll be waiting." Ethan smiled and typed back, "On my way home." And for the first time in a very long time, home didn't mean a place. It meant a person. It meant his son, it meant family, it meant everything Samuel had protected and everything Ethan was finally learning to value. The compass needle pointed north, unwavering in its truth, leading him not to treasure or glory or vindication, but to the only destination that had ever really mattered, the place where people waited who loved you, the place where you could finally stop running and start being present, the place where, after 54 years of searching, Ethan Cole might finally find what he'd been missing all along, himself. The drive from Helena to Seattle took Ethan Cole 3 days, though he could have done it in 2. He stopped in small towns along the way, eating in diners where nobody knew his name or his story, sleeping in motels where the highway noise became a kind of meditation. He wasn't running from anything anymore. He was simply taking his time, letting the landscape change gradually from Montana mountains to Idaho forests to the rain-soaked evergreens of Washington, as if the journey itself was preparation for what waited at the end. On the dashboard, Samuel's compass pointed north with the same steady certainty it had shown for 70 years. Ethan had begun to understand what his grandfather had known. The compass didn't show you where to go. It showed you what mattered, and what mattered was always the same: home, family, the people who loved you despite your failures. The news had broken across Montana like a thunderstorm. By the time Ethan crossed into Idaho, the story had made national headlines. 70-year-old mining fraud exposed. Grandson uncovers evidence of grandfather's murder. Ashford family fortune built on blood and lies. The Associated Press had picked it up. CNN ran a segment. The New York Times published a long investigative piece that traced Resolve Mining's entire history from its founding in 1925 through Richard Ashford's decision to dissolve the company. Ethan had done exactly 2 interviews, one with a Montana public radio journalist who'd been respectful and thorough, another with a documentary filmmaker from PBS who wanted to include Samuel's story in a series about whistleblowers and the price they paid. He'd declined everything else. This wasn't about him becoming famous or being seen as a hero. This was about making sure Samuel Thaddeus Hartwell's name was finally spoken with the honor it deserved. Frank Cross had called twice during the drive, updating him on developments. The FBI had seized all of Resolve's remaining records. They'd discovered evidence of ongoing environmental violations at abandoned mine sites, adding to the company's liability. 3 law firms representing families of other Resolve victims had already filed civil suits. The victim compensation fund Richard Ashford had established before his death was being administered by an independent trustee, and initial assessments suggested it would distribute over $40 million to more than 60 families. James Caldwell's nephew, a man named David Caldwell, who taught history at the University of Montana, had reached out to Ethan through Frank. He wanted to meet someday, to thank him personally for giving his family closure about an uncle he'd never known. Frank said David had cried on the phone when he learned the truth about how James had died. But the call that mattered most had come from Michael the night before Ethan reached Seattle. "Dad, where are you?" Michael had asked. "Just crossed into Washington. I'll be there tomorrow afternoon." There was a pause. "Listen, I know this is a lot. Meeting Sarah, trying to reconnect after 3 years. If you need more time, we can wait." Ethan had pulled over at a rest stop, unable to drive and have this conversation at the same time. "No," he'd said. "I've waited long enough. I've spent my whole life putting things off, telling myself I'd make time later after this project or that deadline." Samuel didn't get a later. He got one choice and one moment, and he made it count. "I don't want to waste any more time." Michael's voice had been thick with emotion. "Okay, Dad, then we'll see you tomorrow." Now, as Ethan navigated Seattle's afternoon traffic, his heart was hammering harder than it had during the press conference. This was scarier than facing the media or the FBI or Richard Ashford. This was facing his own failure as a father and hoping it wasn't too late to build something better. Michael lived in the Fremont neighborhood, an area Ethan had never visited, despite Seattle being only a day's drive from Denver. The apartment building was a converted warehouse with big windows and exposed brick. Ethan parked on the street, grabbed the small overnight bag from his truck, and stood on the sidewalk, gathering courage. The compass was in his jacket pocket. He touched it like a talisman. The intercom crackled when he pressed the button for Unit 304. "Yeah?" A woman's voice. "It's Ethan, Michael's father." There was a buzz, and the door unlocked. Ethan climbed 3 flights of stairs, his knees reminding him again that he wasn't young. The door to 304 opened before he could knock. The woman standing there was in her late 20s, dark hair pulled into a ponytail, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. She had an open, friendly face and direct eyes that assessed him in a single glance. "Mr. Cole," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah." "Ethan," he said, shaking her hand. "Please call me Ethan." She smiled and stepped aside. "Michael's in the kitchen. He's been cooking all afternoon. Fair warning, he stress cooks, so there's enough food to feed a small army." Ethan stepped inside. The apartment was warm and lived in, with mismatched furniture that somehow worked together, bookshelves overflowing and photographs on the walls. His eyes caught on one photo in particular. Michael as a teenager, maybe 15, standing next to Ethan at a construction site, both of them wearing hard hats and smiling. Ethan remembered that day. It was one of the few times he'd brought Michael to work, trying to show him what he did, trying to share that part of his life. He'd thought it had been a failure because Michael had seemed bored. But here the photo was, framed and displayed. "Dad," Ethan turned. Michael stood in the doorway to the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He was 28 now, taller than Ethan by an inch, with his mother's eyes and Ethan's jawline. He'd let his hair grow longer than Ethan remembered. He looked good, healthy, happy. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. 3 years of silence, of missed calls and unanswered messages, of a gulf that had seemed impossible to cross. And now here they were, 10 feet apart in a Seattle apartment, and Ethan had no idea what to say. "Hi, son," he finally managed. Michael set down the dish towel and crossed the room. Ethan braced for a handshake, formal and distant. Instead, Michael pulled him into a hug. It was tight and genuine and lasted longer than Ethan expected. When they separated, both of them had tears in their eyes. "I'm glad you came," Michael said. "Me too." Sarah had diplomatically disappeared into what Ethan assumed was the bedroom, giving them space. Michael gestured to the couch. They sat, and for a minute neither spoke. Then Michael said, "I saw the news coverage, the press conference, the interviews. You did something incredible, Dad." "I just opened a box," Ethan said. "Samuel did the incredible thing." Michael shook his head. "No, you made a choice. You could have kept it private, dealt with it quietly, protected yourself from the scrutiny. But you went public. You made sure people knew the truth. That took guts." Ethan looked at his hands. "I kept thinking about what Samuel gave up. He walked away from everything to protect Dorothy, and I've spent my whole life walking away from you to chase things that didn't matter. Buildings, contracts, recognition. I wanted to do one thing that actually counted. It counted, Michael said quietly. And not just for Samuel's memory. It counted for me too. Ethan looked up. How? Michael took a breath. When I cut you off 3 years ago, I was angry. I felt like you'd chosen work over me my entire childhood. Every missed birthday, every school event you didn't make it to, every weekend you spent at the office instead of with me. It all piled up until I just couldn't do it anymore. I know, Ethan said. You were right to be angry. Maybe. But when you called me from Montana, when you told me about finding the cabin and the evidence, something shifted. I realized you were finally choosing something because it was right, not because it would advance your career or make you money. You were choosing to honor someone. And then when you could have just handed everything to the FBI and walked away, you stayed. You saw it through. Michael's voice grew stronger. That's the dad I always wanted. The one who commits to something because it matters, not because it's profitable. Ethan felt his throat tighten. I'm sorry I didn't figure that out 30 years ago. You're figuring it out now, Michael said. That's what counts. Sarah emerged from the bedroom, sensing the moment had shifted. Dinner's probably ready, she said. If we don't eat soon, Michael's lasagna is going to turn into cement. The meal was surprisingly easy. Sarah was a software engineer working for a startup that built accessibility tools for disabled users. She was funny and sharp and clearly loved Michael deeply. Watching them together, the small touches and inside jokes and comfortable silences, Ethan felt both joy and regret. Joy that his son had found this. Regret that he'd almost missed it entirely. Over dessert, Sarah asked about the compass. Ethan had set it on the table without thinking, and her eyes kept returning to it. That belonged to Samuel? She asked. Ethan nodded. He carried it through the Pacific Campaign in World War II, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, brought it home, and kept it his whole life. When he walked into the mountains, he left it behind in the cabin. Why? Sarah asked. Because he knew he wouldn't need it anymore, Ethan said. He knew where he was going, and he knew someone else would need it more. You, Michael said. Me, Ethan agreed. Though I think he meant it for whoever was lost, whoever needed to find their way home. Are you going to keep it? Sarah asked. Ethan picked up the compass, feeling its familiar weight. I don't know. Part of me thinks it should be in a museum, part of the historical record, but part of me thinks it should stay in the family. Michael was quiet for a moment. Can I see it? Ethan handed it across the table. Michael held it carefully, opening the case, watching the needle swing and settle. He turned it over, reading the engraving on the back. USMC, Samuel T. Hartwell, Iwo Jima 1945, he read aloud. He looked up at Ethan. You should keep it. Give it to your grandkids someday. The words hung in the air. Grandkids. Ethan glanced at Sarah, then back at Michael. Is there something you're not telling me? Michael grinned. Not yet, but maybe soon. We've been talking about it. The emotion that flooded through Ethan was almost overwhelming. The idea that he might get another chance, that he might be able to be the grandfather he hadn't been able to be as a father, felt like undeserved grace. I'd like that, he said quietly. I'd really like that. They talked late into the night. Ethan told them everything. The cabin, the letters, the audio recording, Richard Ashford's deathbed cooperation. Michael and Sarah listened without interrupting, and Ethan found himself telling details he hadn't shared with anyone else. The way the cabin had felt when he'd first opened it, like stepping into a held breath. The moment he'd read his name in Samuel's letter and realized his grandfather had somehow known he would come. The weight of understanding that Samuel had been murdered, hunted down even after he'd chosen to disappear. When he finished, Michael said, What are you going to do now? The question caught Ethan off guard. I don't know. The estate stuff will take months to settle. There'll probably be more interviews, maybe depositions, if the civil cases go to trial. But beyond that, I haven't really thought about it. What about your firm? Sarah asked. Ethan had been avoiding that question. I have good partners. They can run things without me. I've been thinking maybe it's time to step back, let the next generation take over. And do what? Michael asked. Live, Ethan said simply. Be present. Figure out what matters and spend time on that instead of what's urgent. Michael smiled. That sounds like something Samuel would say. I hope so, Ethan said. He stayed in Seattle for 5 days. Michael took time off work, and the three of them explored the city together. They went to Pike Place Market and watched the fishmongers throw salmon. They hiked in Discovery Park, the rain holding off just long enough for them to reach the lighthouse. They had dinner with Sarah's parents, a warm couple who welcomed Ethan without judgment or awkwardness. On the 4th night, Michael asked if Ethan wanted to see his office. It was a small architecture firm in Capitol Hill, and Michael had recently made partner. As they walked through the space, Michael showing him models and renderings, Ethan felt a strange mix of pride and sorrow. His son had become an architect, choosing a path close to, but distinct from his father's engineering. He'd built a successful career without Ethan's help or guidance, and looking at Michael's work, the thoughtful designs that prioritize sustainability and community impact, Ethan realized his son had learned the lesson Ethan was only now understanding. That what you build matters less than why you build it and who it serves. There's something I want to show you, Michael said, leading Ethan to his private office. On the wall behind his desk was a framed blueprint. Ethan recognized it immediately. It was the design for the Denver Convention Center expansion, a project Ethan's firm had completed when Michael was 12. You kept this? Ethan asked. Michael nodded. You brought it home one night to review it. I asked what you were working on, and you explained the whole thing to me. The structural challenges, the way the load would be distributed, the calculations that made it safe. You talked for 2 hours, and I didn't understand half of it, but I loved watching you light up. That was the first time I saw you excited about something, not stressed, not tired, but genuinely excited. Ethan stared at the blueprint, remembering that night. He thought Michael had been bored. I kept it because I wanted to remember that you weren't just absent, Michael said. You were passionate about what you did. You believed in building things that would last. I just wish some of that passion had been for me. It should have been, Ethan said. I'm sorry it wasn't. I know you are, Michael said. And I'm trying to forgive that. But Dad, understanding and forgiving are different things. This week has been good, really good, but it's 1 week. If we're going to rebuild our relationship, it's going to take time. Consistency. You can't just show up now and then disappear again. I won't, Ethan said. I'm done disappearing. On his final night in Seattle, Sarah cooked dinner, a simple pasta dish that somehow tasted like home. Afterward, they sat in the living room, the Seattle rain finally arriving, drumming against the windows. I have something for you, Ethan said. He pulled a small box from his bag and handed it to Michael. Inside was a watch, not expensive or flashy, but solid and well-made. Ethan had bought it that afternoon from a jeweler in Pioneer Square. It's not the compass, he said. That stays with me for now. But I wanted you to have something. A reminder that time is the one thing we can't get back. I wasted a lot of yours. I don't want to waste any more. Michael put on the watch, the leather band settling on his wrist like it belonged there. Thank you, Dad. There's an engraving, Ethan said, on the back. Michael took it off and read aloud. For Michael, the time is now. Love, Dad. He looked up, his eyes wet. I love it. They hugged again, and this time it was easier, more natural. When Ethan finally left, promising to call every week and visit again next month, he felt lighter than he had in years. The drive back to Denver took 2 days. Ethan spent them thinking about what came next. He'd been running his firm for 25 years. It had been his identity, his purpose, his excuse for everything else he'd neglected. But maybe it was time to let it go. Not abandon it, but release it to the people who'd helped build it. His partners were younger, hungrier, better suited to the demands of modern construction management. They didn't need him micromanaging anymore. Maybe they never had. When he reached Denver, instead of going to his condo, he drove to his office. It was a Saturday, and the building was mostly empty. He sat at his desk and wrote a letter to his partners, outlining a transition plan. He'd step back to an advisory role over the next 6 months, retain a small ownership stake, but remove himself from daily operations. He'd make himself available for major decisions, but they would run the company. He sealed the letter and left it on the conference room table for Monday morning. Then he went to his condo and started packing. He didn't need 3,000 square feet in the city. He didn't need to be 10 minutes from the office when he was barely going to be there. What he needed was space to think, to breathe, to figure out who Ethan Cole was when he wasn't building things. Over the next 2 weeks, he sold the condo and most of his furniture. He kept the essentials and put them in storage. And then he did something he'd never done in his entire adult life. He took a month off with no plan. He drove back to Montana and spent a week in Ashford Creek. The cabin had become something of a pilgrimage site. The State Historical Society had installed a plaque near the trailhead, Samuel T. Hartwell Cabin, 1951 to 1954, in memory of a man who sacrificed everything to protect his family and preserve the truth. Ethan hiked up one morning and found a young couple at the cabin, reading the plaque. They asked if he was just visiting or if he knew the story. He told them he was Samuel's grandson, and their faces lit up with recognition. They'd seen the news coverage. They wanted to shake his hand and tell him how inspiring the story was. After they left, Ethan sat on the cabin porch and called Frank Cross. "How are you holding up?" Frank asked. "Good," Ethan said. "Really good, actually. I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "The cabin. What happens to it long term? Does it just sit here?" Frank was quiet for a moment. "The Historical Society wants to preserve it, maybe open it for guided tours eventually. But that's years away. Funding, liability issues, all of that. For now, it'll stay as is." "I want to help," Ethan said. "I want to donate money to maintain it, make sure it's protected. Maybe create some kind of scholarship fund in Samuel's name for students studying ethics or whistleblower protection or something." Frank's voice was warm. "I think Samuel would like that." They talked for another hour, planning. Frank knew people at the University of Montana. Between them and Ethan's resources, they could create something meaningful. Not a monument to pain, but a reminder that courage still mattered. That standing up for truth, even at terrible cost, was worth honoring. When Ethan finally returned to Denver, it was late March. Spring was coming to the Rockies, snow melting, green pushing through brown. He found a small house to rent in the foothills west of the city, a place with a view of the mountains and a porch where he could sit and think. Michael called every Sunday, keeping his promise just as Ethan kept his. They talked about everything and nothing. Work, Sarah's new project, a hike they'd taken, Ethan's progress sorting through his mother's remaining belongings. The conversations were short at first, awkward, both of them still learning how to talk without the weight of resentment between them. But slowly over weeks it got easier. In late April, Michael called with news. "Dad," he said, his voice barely containing excitement. "Sarah's pregnant." Ethan sat down, his heart suddenly full. "How far along?" 10 weeks. We just had the ultrasound. Everything looks good." "Congratulations," Ethan whispered. "I'm so happy for you, both of you." "We want you involved," Michael said. "If you want to be. We want the baby to know their grandfather." "I want that more than anything," Ethan said. That night, he took out the compass and held it under the porch light. The brass had grown warm from being in his pocket constantly. The needle pointed north, steady as always. He thought about Samuel, who'd never met his grandchild, who died in the snow, murdered for protecting the truth, never knowing that 70 years later, his sacrifice would bring a family back together. "Thank you," Ethan said aloud, "for showing me what matters. For leaving the compass, for being strong enough to walk away so Dorothy could live. She had a good life, you know. She married a good man. She had me. She got to be a grandmother. You gave her that." The wind moved through the pines, and Ethan felt that same presence he'd felt at the cabin. Not haunting, but accompanying. Samuel's story was told now. His name was cleared. His courage was recognized. But more than that, his legacy was alive in the choices Ethan was making, in the relationship being rebuilt with Michael, in the grandchild who would grow up knowing that family wasn't just blood, but the decisions you made to protect and honor the people you loved. Ethan went inside and pulled out a notebook. He began to write, documenting everything, not just the facts of what had happened, but the feelings, the fear and hope and regret and redemption. He wrote about Samuel's letters and the cabin, and the moment he'd heard his grandfather's name in a recording from 1954. He wrote about Richard Ashford's confession and Frank Cross's decades-long search for truth. He wrote about Michael's forgiveness and the promise of a grandchild he'd get to know. This story needed to be preserved, not just in legal documents and news articles, but in words that captured what it had meant, what it still meant. He worked through the night, the compass on the desk beside him, its needle pointing north toward everything he'd almost lost and everything he'd finally found. By dawn, he had 30 pages. It was a beginning, just like everything else in his life right now. A beginning. Not perfect, not finished, but honest and real, and full of the kind of hope that only comes after you've walked through darkness and found your way home. The compass gleamed in the morning light, still pointing north, still keeping time for two. Samuel's time had ended in a Montana blizzard 70 years ago, but Ethan's time, the time he had left to be a better man, a present father, a loving grandfather, that time was just beginning. And this time, he wouldn't waste a single moment of it. October came to the Absaroka Mountains with gold and crimson fire. The aspens blazed against the dark pines, and the air carried that peculiar clarity that belongs only to autumn in high country. Ethan Cole stood on the porch of Samuel's cabin, watching the sun rise over peaks dusted with the season's first snow. He was 55 now, a year older than when he'd first driven north from Denver, following a mystery hidden in his mother's closet. A year that had changed everything. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Michael stepped out, carrying 2 cups of coffee, steam rising in the cold air. He handed one to his father and stood beside him, both men silent for a moment, taking in the view. "It's beautiful up here," Michael said finally. "It is," Ethan agreed. "Your great-grandfather had good taste." They'd driven up together the day before, father and son making the pilgrimage that had become a twice-yearly ritual. Spring and fall, they came to the cabin, spending a weekend hiking, talking, maintaining the structure that had become a touchstone for their rebuilt relationship. Sarah had stayed in Seattle this time. She was 7 months pregnant, too far along for mountain roads and high altitude. But she'd sent them with a list of photos to take and a request that they scatter wildflower seeds near the cabin for next spring. The Montana Historical Society had officially taken ownership of the property 6 months earlier, but they'd granted the family unlimited access. The cabin itself had been carefully preserved, every item cataloged and protected, but left in place. Visitors could tour it by appointment, walking through the same room where Samuel Hartwell had made the hardest choice a father could face, a choice that had echoed across 70 years and somehow saved a family that hadn't even fully existed yet. Today was special, though. Today wasn't just a visit. Today was a dedication. At noon, they would unveil a memorial, not just for Samuel, but for all of them. James Caldwell, Thomas Price, the others whose names had been recovered from Resolve Mining's records. Men who died for asking questions, for pursuing truth, for standing against corruption when silence would have been safer. Frank Cross was already at the site, a meadow half a mile from the cabin where the memorial had been constructed. Ethan and Michael finished their coffee and began the hike down. The trail was well maintained now, marked with signs, safe for the families who would come to pay respects. When they emerged from the trees, Ethan stopped, his breath catching. The memorial was simple but powerful. A circle of stones, each one carved with a name and dates. In the center stood a bronze statue, life-sized, of a man walking into wind. His coat was pulled tight, his head down, but his stride was determined. One hand held a compass. The face was Samuel's, rendered from the photographs Ethan had provided. But it could have been any man choosing courage over comfort, truth over safety. At the base of the statue, words were engraved into granite. They walked so others could stand, in memory of those who sacrificed everything to protect the truth. Frank stood beside the statue, and with him were others. David Caldwell, James's nephew, now in his 60s. His wife and 3 adult children, Robert Price's daughter, an elderly woman who'd traveled from California to honor a father she'd lost when she was 4 years old. 2 documentary filmmakers who'd spent the past year creating a feature film about Samuel's story. a reporter from the New York Times who'd followed the case since the first press conference. And standing slightly apart, leaning on a cane, was a woman Ethan didn't recognize. She was in her late 70s, thin and elegant, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of decades. Frank caught Ethan's questioning look and walked over. "There's someone I want you to meet," Frank said quietly. He gestured to the woman, who approached slowly, her movements careful but dignified. "Ethan Cole," Frank said. "This is Margaret Hartwell Patterson, Samuel's daughter, your aunt." The world seemed to tilt. Ethan stared at the woman, his mind racing. His mother, Dorothy, had been an only child. Samuel and his wife, Margaret, had only had one daughter, hadn't they? The woman smiled gently, reading his confusion. "I'm not a biological daughter," she said. Her voice was soft but clear. "I was adopted. In 1956, 2 years after Samuel died. His wife, your grandmother, she took me in. I was 6 years old, orphaned. Margaret Hartwell was working as a nurse, and she fostered me first, then adopted me. She gave me her name. She raised me as her own." Ethan found his voice. "I never knew." "Your mother did," the woman said. "Dorothy was 10 when I came to live with them. She was kind to me, protective. We were sisters until the day your grandmother died in 1972. After that, we drifted apart. Different cities, different lives. But I never forgot the Hartwell name or what it meant." "What did it mean to you?" Ethan asked. "That some people are strong enough to build families from broken pieces," she said. "Your grandmother lost her husband, but she didn't let that loss define her. She opened her home to a child who had no one. She taught me that family isn't just blood, it's choice." Ethan felt his throat tighten. He looked at Michael, who was listening intently, then back at this woman who carried Samuel's name despite no blood connection. She was right. Family was choice. It was Samuel choosing to walk into the snow to protect Dorothy. It was Dorothy choosing to keep his secrets to keep him safe, even in memory. It was Ethan choosing to come to Montana instead of burying the past. It was Michael choosing to forgive and rebuild. "I'm glad you're here," Ethan said. "I'm glad you came." "I wouldn't miss it," Margaret said. "I wanted to honor the man whose name I carry. Even though I never met him, his legacy gave me a family. That's worth remembering." The ceremony began at noon sharp. Frank spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. He talked about his Uncle James, about a young engineer who died for discovering the truth. He talked about the decades he'd spent searching for justice, for answers, for some way to make the loss mean something. And he talked about how one man's courage, 70 years delayed, had finally brought light to darkness. David Caldwell spoke next. He read a letter his Uncle James had written to his mother in 1949, just weeks before his death. In it, James talked about knowing something was wrong at Resolve but being afraid to speak up. He talked about meeting Samuel Hartwell and finding someone he could trust. He talked about hoping that doing the right thing wouldn't cost too much. "It cost everything," David said, his voice breaking. "But because of men like Samuel Hartwell, because of people willing to preserve the truth no matter the price, my uncle's name has been cleared. His death is recognized for what it was, murder. And the men responsible, even though they're gone, their crimes are known. That matters." When it was Ethan's turn to speak, he walked to the front of the small gathering and looked at the statue of his grandfather. The sculptor had captured something essential. Not just Samuel's features, but his determination. His refusal to surrender even when surrender would have been easier. Ethan pulled a folded paper from his jacket. He'd written his remarks the night before, sitting in the cabin by lamplight, trying to find words adequate to the moment. "I never met Samuel Hartwell," he began. "He died 16 years before I was born. But this past year, I've gotten to know him in ways that feel more real than many relationships between people who share the same time and space. I've read his letters. I've listened to his voice on recordings made in his final hours. I've walked the same trails he walked and sat in the same cabin, where he made the choice that would define not just his legacy, but the trajectory of a family he would never see." He paused, looking at the faces before him, Michael, Frank, Margaret, the families of other victims, strangers who'd been moved by the story. Samuel Hartwell was not a perfect man, Ethan continued. He was distant sometimes, consumed by work, haunted by war. He made mistakes. But when the moment came, when he had to choose between his own safety and his daughter's life, he didn't hesitate. He chose her. He chose love over self-preservation. And in doing so, he showed us what courage actually looks like. The wind moved through the aspens, leaves rattling like applause. For 70 years, Samuel's sacrifice was hidden, Ethan said. My mother, Dorothy, grew up thinking she'd been abandoned. She carried that wound her whole life, but she never stopped loving her father, and she never destroyed the evidence he'd left behind. She kept it safe, waiting, hoping that someday someone would understand, that someone would finish what Samuel started. He looked at Michael. I came to Montana looking for closure about a grandfather I'd never known. What I found was a mirror. I saw my own failures reflected in Samuel's struggles. I saw how easy it is to choose work over family, achievement over presence, building things over building relationships. And I saw what happens when you finally choose differently. Ethan folded the paper and spoke from his heart. This memorial honors the men who died fighting corruption. But it also honors something bigger. It honors the idea that truth matters, that integrity matters, that some things are worth sacrificing for. Samuel walked into those mountains knowing he would die. But he walked anyway because his daughter's life mattered more than his own. That's not just courage. That's love in its purest form. He stepped back, and there was a long silence. Then applause, quiet and respectful, rippled through the gathering. The unveiling of the memorial marker happened without ceremony. Frank and David simply pulled away the cloth covering the bronze plaque listing all the names. Samuel Thaddeus Hartwell, 1906 to 1954. James Robert Caldwell, 1918 to 1949. Thomas Henry Price, 1903 to 1946. 4 others whose stories were still being pieced together. Men who'd been erased from history and were now being remembered. After the ceremony, people dispersed slowly. Some walked to the individual stones, placing flowers or simply standing in silence. Others gathered in small groups, sharing stories, making connections. David Caldwell approached Ethan with an old photograph. I wanted you to have this, David said. It's James and Samuel together, taken in the summer of 1952, I think. My father kept it all these years. The photograph showed 2 men standing in front of a mine entrance. Both were smiling, relaxed, unaware of what was coming. Samuel looked younger than in the later photos Ethan had seen. His eyes held less weight. Thank you, Ethan said, accepting the photo carefully. I'll treasure this. They were friends, David said. My uncle wrote about Samuel in his diary. He said Samuel was the kind of man who listened more than he talked, who thought before he acted, who could be trusted with difficult truths. The world needs more men like that. It does, AZNCC. Ethan agreed. That evening, after everyone had left and the meadow was empty except for the memorial standing silent in the fading light, Ethan and Michael hiked back to the cabin. They built a fire in the wood stove, cooked a simple dinner, and sat in the gathering darkness, neither feeling the need to fill the silence with words. Finally, Michael spoke. Do you think he knew? Samuel, do you think he knew what would happen? That 70 years later all of this would come from what he did? Ethan considered the question. The compass sat on the table between them, catching the firelight. I don't think he knew the details, but I think he believed the truth would matter eventually. That evidence preserved would someday find the right person. That's why he was so careful documenting everything. He was leaving breadcrumbs for someone he'd never meet. And you found them, Michael said. We found them, Ethan corrected. You helped me understand why it mattered. When I called you from here that first time, you could have told me to let it go. To come home, to stop chasing ghosts. But you didn't. You told me to do the right thing. That gave me the courage to see it through. Michael smiled. So we're both following Samuel's example, making choices that cost something but matter anyway. Exactly, Ethan said. They stayed at the cabin for 2 more days, hiking during the day and talking by firelight at night. They discussed the baby coming in December, the name Michael and Sarah were considering, the kind of grandfather Ethan wanted to be. They talked about Dorothy, about how she'd carried the weight of secrets and sacrifices she'd never fully understood. They talked about Robert, Ethan's father, and how the pattern of absent men seemed to run through the family like a genetic inheritance, until Ethan had finally decided to break it. On their last morning, Ethan woke early and walked to Copper Creek. The water ran clear and cold, the same water Samuel had fished with Dorothy all those years ago. Ethan pulled the compass from his pocket and held it over the stream, watching the needle point north with unwavering certainty. He thought about the journey this small brass instrument had made, from a factory somewhere during World War II to the Pacific Theater, across Iwo Jima and Okinawa, through smoke and blood and chaos, home to Montana, carried by a Marine who'd survived war but couldn't survive the choice between truth and family, hidden in a cabin for 70 years, found by a grandson searching for meaning, and now here, still working, still pointing north, still keeping faith with its purpose. Ethan opened the back of his truck and pulled out a wooden box he'd brought from Denver. Inside was something he'd been working on for months. A case, custom made, with a glass front and a brass plaque. The plaque read, "The Hartwell Compass, carried by Samuel T. Hartwell, USMC, through the Pacific Campaign 1943 to 1945, and through the mountains of Montana 1951 to 1954, left for those who come after, to find their way home." He'd decided the compass wouldn't go to a museum. It would stay in the family. But he wanted it protected, honored, ready to pass to Michael, and then to Michael's child and beyond. A tangible reminder that some things endure, that courage echoes across generations, that the choices we make ripple forward in ways we can't predict but must trust matter. When they drove away from the cabin that afternoon, Ethan looked back one last time. The structure stood solid against the mountain, smoke rising from the chimney where they'd let the fire burn down naturally. It looked lived in, loved, purposeful, no longer a tomb of silence, but a testament to speaking truth. The drive back to Denver took all day. They stopped in Ashford Creek for lunch at the Prospector, where Earl, now walking with a cane but still sharp as ever, welcomed them like family. He asked about the baby, about the memorial, about whether they'd seen the article in National Geographic about Samuel's story. The whole town had read it, Earl said, made them proud to be from here. When Ethan finally dropped Michael at the Denver airport for his flight back to Seattle, their goodbye was easy, comfortable, full of promises to talk soon and plans for Thanksgiving. "Drive safe, Dad," Michael said. "Always," Ethan replied. "Give Sarah my love." He watched his son walk into the terminal and felt nothing but gratitude. A year ago, Michael wouldn't have answered his calls. Now they were planning holidays together, preparing to welcome a new generation, building something that would last. Ethan drove to his small house in the foothills as the sun set over the Rockies. Inside, he set the compass in its new case on the mantel, positioning it carefully. Then he sat at his desk and opened his laptop. The book was nearly finished. 6 months of work, writing in the early mornings and late evenings, crafting the story of Samuel Hartwell and the cabin that had held its secrets for 7 decades. It wasn't just a true crime story or a historical account. It was a meditation on legacy, on family, on the choices that define us and the courage required to make them. He'd sent the manuscript to 3 publishers. 2 had already responded with offers. One was a major house in New York, promising a large advance in national marketing. The other was a smaller Montana press that specialized in regional history and wanted to donate a portion of proceeds to the scholarship fund Ethan had established in Samuel's name. Ethan chose the Montana press. The money didn't matter. What mattered was getting the story right, honoring it properly, making sure the proceeds went towards something Samuel would have valued: education, truth, the next generation learning to stand up even when standing up costs something. November brought the first real snow to Colorado. Ethan spent Thanksgiving in Seattle with Michael and Sarah, meeting her extended family, feeling welcomed and included in a way he hadn't experienced in years. On Black Friday, while everyone else was shopping, he and Michael drove to a baby furniture store and spent 3 hours picking out a crib, a changing table, and a rocking chair that Ethan insisted on buying. That's too much, Dad," Michael protested. "Let me," Ethan said, "please. I miss so much with you. Let me do this." Michael relented, and Ethan felt a small piece of his failures being redeemed. December arrived with cold winds and crystalline skies. The book was scheduled for publication in March, time to coincide with the documentary that would air on PBS. Frank Cross had been heavily involved in both projects, ensuring accuracy, protecting the memories of those who'd been lost. On December 15th at 2 in the morning, Ethan's phone rang. Michael's voice was excited, exhausted, perfect. "Dad, she's here. 8 pounds, 6 ounces. Everyone's healthy." "Congratulations," Ethan whispered, his eyes filling. "What's her name?" "We're calling her Dorothy. Dorothy Sarah Cole. After both of her great-grandmothers." Ethan couldn't speak. The weight of that choice, the honor of it, the deliberate decision to carry the name forward, connected the generations in a way that felt sacred. "Can I visit?" he finally managed. "Tomorrow," Michael said. "Come as soon as you can." Ethan drove through the night, arriving in Seattle as dawn broke over Puget Sound. At the hospital, he held his granddaughter for the first time, this tiny, perfect human who represented everything Samuel had fought to protect: the future, the continuation of family, the hope that what we sacrifice for endures beyond our own lives. Dorothy Sarah Cole had Dorothy Hartwell's eyes and Sarah's dark hair and her father's strong hands. She was awake and alert, looking at Ethan with the unfocused but somehow knowing gaze of the very new. "Welcome to the world, little one," Ethan whispered. "You're named after someone brave, someone who kept secrets to keep people safe, someone who believed in family even when family meant sacrifice." The baby gripped his finger, her tiny hand impossibly strong. Over the next week, Ethan stayed in Seattle, helping where he could, mostly just being present. He changed diapers and did dishes and made food runs and held Dorothy while Michael and Sarah caught brief moments of sleep. He was there, fully, completely, without distraction or divided attention. There, on Christmas Eve, with Dorothy asleep in her bassinet and Sarah resting in the bedroom, Ethan and Michael sat in the living room, the lights of the tree casting soft colors across the walls. "I brought something," Ethan said. He pulled out a wrapped package and handed it to Michael. Inside was the photograph David Caldwell had given him. Samuel and James in front of the mine, smiling, alive, unaware of what was coming, but also a second photo. One Ethan had taken in October. Michael and Ethan standing in front of Samuel's cabin, father and son, echoing the pose from 70 years earlier. 2 generations, 2 pairs of men, all connected by blood and choice and the belief that some things mattered enough to fight for. Beneath the photos was a letter, handwritten on good paper. For Michael, it read, "This is the story of how I found my way home. It starts with a grandfather I never met and a cabin locked for 70 years. But really, it starts with you, with losing you, and realizing too late what I'd thrown away." Samuel Hartwell walked into the mountains to protect his daughter. I drove to Montana to honor his memory. But what I found there was a map back to you. The compass doesn't point to places. It points to people. It points to what matters. You matter, son. Dorothy matters. This family we're building together, this legacy of choosing love over comfort and presence over productivity, this matters. Samuel's time ran out in 1954. Mine is still going. And I'm going to spend every moment I have left making sure you and Dorothy and whoever comes after know they are loved. Not in words or promises, but in presence, in showing up, in being there. Thank you for giving me another chance. Thank you for being the man I should have been. Your father with more love than I know how to express, Ethan. Michael read it twice, his eyes wet. Then he set it down carefully and looked at his father. "You know what the best part of this whole year has been?" Michael asked. "What?" Ethan said. "That you're here," Michael said simply. "Not in Montana chasing Samuel's story. Not at the office building something. Not anywhere else. You're here, with us. That's all I ever wanted." "It's all I want too," Ethan said. They sat in comfortable silence, the baby breathing softly, the lights twinkling, the world outside cold and dark, but the world inside warm and full of exactly the kind of richness that can't be built or bought or earned, only chosen and nurtured and protected. In late January, Ethan returned to Montana one last time before the book launched. He wanted to see the cabin in winter, to experience what Samuel had experienced in those final days. The snow was deep, the hike difficult, but he made it. The cabin was locked and cold, preserved but empty. He didn't go inside, he just stood on the porch, looking at the mountains, thinking about the man who'd walked into that white expanse and never returned. "Thank you," he said aloud, "for everything you gave up, for the example you set, for the compass that brought me home." The wind answered, moving through the frozen pines, and Ethan felt a deep sense of completion. The story was told. The truth was known. The family was whole again. Samuel's sacrifice had been honored not just in memorials and books, but in the living choices of those who came after. Ethan pulled out his phone and took one last photograph. The cabin, the mountains, the endless white. Then he turned and hiked back down, leaving the past in its proper place, behind him, honored but not defining, remembered but not consuming. The book released in March to strong reviews and surprising sales. It hit regional bestseller lists and was featured in newspapers across Montana and Wyoming. The PBS documentary aired in April and was watched by 3 million people. Ethan did a small book tour, speaking at libraries and bookstores, always emphasizing that this wasn't his story. It was Samuel's. He was just the one fortunate enough to find it. In May, on a warm spring evening, Ethan sat on his porch in Colorado, watching the sun set over the mountains. His phone rang. It was Frank Cross. "Thought you'd want to know?" Frank said. "The Victim Compensation Fund made its final distribution today. 63 families received settlements. Total of $42 million. It's done." "How do you feel?" Ethan asked. "Lighter," Frank said. "Like I can finally let my uncle rest." "We did it, Ethan. We made it mean something." "We did," Ethan agreed. After the call, Ethan sat in the growing darkness, the compass on the table beside him. Its brass surface caught the last light, glowing warm and golden. He thought about all the hands that had held this instrument. Samuel's hands, steady in war and trembling in those final moments. Dorothy's hands, small and trusting when her father had shown her how to read it. His own hands, lost and searching. And someday, Dorothy Sarah's hands when she was old enough to understand what it meant and why it mattered. The needle pointed north. It would always point north. Not to a destination, but to a truth. That home wasn't a place, but a choice. That family was what you protected, and who you showed up for. That legacy wasn't what you left behind, but what you lived for. Ethan picked up the compass and held it to his heart, feeling its weight, its history, its promise. Samuel Hartwell had walked into a blizzard 71 years ago, carrying this compass, knowing he would never use it again. But he'd left it behind for someone who would, someone who needed to find their way home. And after a lifetime of being lost in achievement and productivity and the hollow pursuit of building monuments to nothing, Ethan had finally found his way. Not to a place on a map, but to his son, to his granddaughter, to the understanding that the only thing worth building was a family held together by love and sacrifice, and the daily choice to be present. The compass had done its job. It had pointed north through war and peace, through mountains and decades, through loss and redemption. And now it sat in Ethan's hands, ready to guide the next generation, when their time came to be lost and searching and hoping for a way home. Somewhere in the darkness, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the voices of those who'd walked before. Samuel, Dorothy, Robert. All the generations who'd struggled and sacrificed and somehow, against all odds, managed to pass forward something worth keeping. Not money or property or fame, but the simple, profound truth that some things matter more than survival. Love matters, truth matters, standing up when standing up, costs everything matters. And being there, fully present, for the people who need you, that matters most of all. Ethan closed his eyes and felt the compass warm in his hands, pointing north, always north, toward everything that had ever mattered and everything that ever would. Home.